I was betrayed by everyone I loved. My wife, my kids, my own family, they all turned against me. Framed for a murder I didn't commit, I was thrown into a living hell. Shackled, beaten, and humiliated, I lost everything. But I survived. With the help of Victoria, the one person who saw through the lies, I uncovered the real killers. Now it's my turn. I've devised a ruthless plan for revenge. They will feel the pain they inflicted on me. This is my story of vengeance. Enjoy watching it. Mike. Crushed. That's the only word I could think of to describe what I felt. While everyone around me shouted with joy, feeling victorious over what they wanted, I sat in silence. They were so loud, cheering and high-fiving each other, forgetting the heavy atmosphere that had filled the room just moments before. I could hardly hear myself think over all the excitement. No one cared about my pain. In fact, they seemed to celebrate it. I didn't really understand what was happening. I slumped in my chair, my hands trembling slightly, still tied to the desk in front of me. The courtroom table where I had been sitting for the last month was fixed to the floor, and my leg restraints would stop me from moving anywhere fast, even if I had the chance. After all the interviews and the stress of the trial, I was still confused. I couldn't wrap my head around how my life had turned upside down. I looked at my lawyer, a young man fresh out of law school, and felt a mix of sadness and disbelief when I saw him smiling and joining in with the others. He saw my upset face and leaned down to me, grinning widely. "Bad luck, my friend," he said, patting me on the head before walking off to join the celebrations. Not very professional, but no one would call him out on it. I sat there, surrounded by the happy noise of the courtroom. The high fives and laughter about my guilty verdict made me feel sick. I had never felt so lonely. I couldn't turn to look at the crowd behind me. I feared the cold looks from people I once thought cared for me. I remembered the moment when the jury announced the guilty verdict. Their faces were serious and disappointed as they read it out loud. The judge had spoken too, saying that if the death penalty was still an option, he would have considered it. There was nothing else I could do. I put my head in my hands and cried. I had received 2 life sentences with no chance for parole. I could appeal, of course, but who would take my case? The crimes I had been found guilty of were too horrible for any decent lawyer to want to defend me. Public defenders would likely just add to my troubles. I felt lost, alone, and hated by so many people. There was no sympathy anywhere. The prosecution attorney, Miss Victoria Brown, stood tall in the courtroom. She was determined to bring me to justice. Using all the information and evidence against me, she painted a picture of my supposed crimes in great detail. She prepared her case well, using every bit of evidence, interviews, and witness statements to show her point. If I had been part of the audience or the jury, I would have been impressed by how she skillfully used each piece of evidence against me. She dismissed my lawyer's weak arguments with ease. She tore apart my claims of being innocent as if it was nothing serious. Innocent. That was the heart of the matter. I was innocent. I had not done the terrible things everyone said I did. No one believed me. No one wanted to listen, not my wife, my kids, friends, parents, or siblings. Since my arrest, they only hurled insults at me. Not once did anyone ask if I was really innocent. While I waited for my trial, some guards took pleasure in showing me news clips where my family spoke against me. They seemed so sure of my guilt. After my arrest, my family was brought into the room where I was being held. I was restrained in the cell, and despite my pleas for understanding, my mother, ex-wife, and daughter each expressed their disappointment in their own way. Despite my attempts to explain my innocence, my family seemed indifferent to my distress. When they finished, the guards turned on the camera again, challenging me to complain. I stayed silent as they dragged me back to my cell, where I sobbed alone. Now, after the verdict and sentencing, I had nothing behind me to look to. There was also nothing ahead of me, so I just stared at my hands and cried, something I had done often since all this started. A few moments later, I felt a hand touch my shoulder. I flinched. In the past few months, any touch had brought me nothing but pain. I bore the bruises, a reminder of that. So when I felt a hand, I instinctively pulled away. But we were still in the courtroom, and even though the world seemed against me, I didn't think I would be harmed with all the media watching. I looked up carefully, and I saw the woman who helped decide my fate kneeling next to me. Victoria Brown had a strange look on her face. Throughout the trial and interviews before it, she had been tough, asking question after question. It didn't matter that I said I was innocent. She ignored my feelings and got every detail of my life from me and from anyone I knew. She found out about my friends, my favorite foods, and even what I liked to watch. My friends and family helped her with everything, and she used that information against me. The serious way she had acted all those months was very different from how she looked now. She seemed concerned. "Mr. Other?" she asked, waiting for me to pay attention. I looked into her eyes, surprised to see compassion there. "I can't say I'm sorry or surprised by the decision, but I do regret my colleagues' earlier comments. They were rude and uncalled for," she said, mentioning something my defense lawyer said that she must have heard. She then looked at the celebration going on behind me and frowned. "This is also wrong." I didn't know how to respond. Just an hour before, she had been harsh with me, and now this kindness felt surprising in a room filled with anger. I nodded slowly. "The case is done now," she told me. "Soon they will take you away." "Is there a message you want me to give to anyone?" she asked, a question I didn't expect from someone who had tried so hard to convict me. For a moment I thought, shook my head, then nodded. We both knew that no one wanted to hear from me. I looked at her as she waited. I quickly replayed the last several months in my mind. I thought back to that night when everything changed, and then I remembered the events that followed. My mind raced back to my first meeting with Victoria Brown. She had been the ultimate professional, asking for my name, some basic facts, and then my story. When I told her what happened, unlike others, she also asked if I had committed the crimes I was accused of. After pleading my innocence again, I told her. "You need to find them," I had said, my voice filled with emotion during that first interview when she asked about the real culprits. "Them?" Victoria had asked, her forehead creased. I nodded. "Both of them. There were at least two." I didn't have solid proof. I had never seen their faces clearly, just the pain they caused and the damage they did to my life. Back in the courtroom, it was her victory and my loss. As we sat in the chaos of the media frenzy that had become my life, Victoria's brow furrowed even more. My message was just for her. I whispered, "Find them." She understood right away what I meant. As a lawyer working for the Crown, Victoria was brought in to finish me off. The police and many others had already labeled me guilty, and they wanted to bury me in front of the eager media. There was so much evidence, reports, and interviews, most of it made up to support their case. Victoria's job was now easier because she had instructions to make me look bad. Her opponent was a young public defender who didn't care about helping me at all. This made Victoria's job even simpler. Even if she had shared every piece of evidence, the outcome would have stayed the same. But Victoria was always professional. Out of everyone who had questioned me, she never lost her cool. She never let her feelings, which I knew were there, or the public eye affect her work. She was the only one during the whole trial who asked if I had committed the crime. She made sure that went on the record. It was the one moment that got her a negative response from everyone else. When I said I was innocent, no one paid attention, and everyone but Victoria laughed at my plea of not guilty. As I sat there crying about the verdict, I felt utterly broken. Victoria looked at me with real concern, but before she could say more, my guards pushed her aside. They unfastened me from the desk and started to lead me out. Then suddenly, I noticed movement behind us in the gallery. For a brief moment, I thought it might be something to rescue me, but luck was not on my side. A balloon filled with sticky red paint hit the side of my head, bursting and splattering me from head to toe. The dark red paint looked like blood as the person threw it and yelled, "Murderer!" Matilda, my teenage daughter, laughed as she threw her balloon. She hadn't spoken to me since that day in the interview room. At first, she was unsure, but then her mother and my parents encouraged her. Her hand hurt as she left the room. But now, with the trial over, she showed her final act of defiance, breaking our once close father-daughter bond. As I turned my head covered in paint, I saw May Bustoff, the mother of the victim. She and her husband were the only ones not celebrating or laughing. They had been there every day, sitting quietly. Now that it was all over, she had lost control and was in tears as her husband held her. Out of everyone in that room, they were the ones I felt most sorry for, more than myself. Everyone else cheered and laughed as my guards pulled me out of the room. Everyone cheered as my daughter, Matilda, threw red paint at her father. I took a brief look at her. For just a moment I saw a frown on her face, but then she was back to smiling and laughing with my former family. Meanwhile, I was led away by the guards, feeling like my life had changed forever. They pushed me out the door and into a waiting police van. The media called me Murder Mike. Before my trial could even start, someone shared the accusations and personal details about me. I didn't stand a chance. The world had already judged me guilty before the charges were even read in court. Murder. They said I had kidnapped and killed 2 young sisters. Everyone was so shocked by the crime that they didn't want to look for any other answers. No one cared that I was crying, trying to help them. I still remember the last kind words from Maisie, the older sister, as she spoke to her younger sister, Tina. I was taken by surprise when the police tackled me to the ground, putting handcuffs on me as I begged for help. In the days that followed, I fell into a deep sadness. Every call I made for help was ignored. People wanted to blame me for their hurt, and no matter what I said, it seemed everyone agreed that I should be the one to pay for their pain. The guards laughed at me as they put me in the van, still covered in the red paint. I could hear them mocking my discomfort as they slammed the door shut. There was no light, no hope, no future for someone who was innocent. Victoria. I watched as they pulled Mike Other out of the courtroom, covered in paint from Matilda's balloon. I shivered at the scene. His family should have been heartbroken about his conviction, but instead, they celebrated. I knew they would feel lost once the excitement faded. No family is perfect, and Mike's certainly wasn't. But this loud celebration and mockery of a guilty man wasn't right, and would lead them to deep sadness later. I returned to my desk, stepping around the paint on the old blue carpet. I greeted my colleagues with handshakes and smiles. I gathered my notes, putting them in my bag. Next week, I would submit everything for record-keeping. I usually enjoyed my success, but the worry I felt while packing my papers would not go away. From the day I got this case, something felt off. It should have been my big moment. When the news broke, Mike Other became the most wanted man across the country. His terrible crime against the Bustoff sisters had shocked everyone. Today, I managed to put one of Australia's most dangerous criminals behind bars for life, ensuring he could never hurt anyone again. I should feel proud of that. I talked to the man the media called Murder Mike many times. Like many others I had dealt with before, he insisted he was innocent. His family and friends quickly pointed out his past mistakes. They talked about missed events because he was busy with work, the times he lost his temper, and the worry over where he was the night of the incident. They explained that he was taking a longer route home when there was a faster option close by. Even with his claims of innocence, the police had enough evidence against him. Mike's car had blood on the seats, and it was found with the doors wide open. Reports said he was holding the 2 sisters when the police found him. Despite all this, Mike stuck to his not guilty plea. I felt uneasy when a search of the area found no sign of the murder weapon. However, police and several experts said he could have tossed it away before the authorities arrived. There was also the emergency call Mike made to 000. About 40 minutes before he was found, he called to say he was pulling over. He mentioned another car on the side of the road with the doors open and a flashlight moving through the trees. This call was confirmed, and a psychologist said in court that Mike was trying to clear himself of blame by making the call. But then, there was the look in his eyes. I had seen many criminals in my career. Usually a guilty verdict brings anger, guilt, or even regret. In one murder case, the guilty man seemed pleased, feeling he had dealt with his cheating wife and her lover. But with Mike, from the first moment I met him, his eyes troubled me. I didn't like that my job was to push for a conviction but not really look for the truth. My attempts to gather more evidence were pointless. No one wanted to help Mike Other prove his innocence. For the past few months, the stress and pressure to get a guilty verdict had been overwhelming. My bosses wanted nothing less than a life sentence for him, and the public defender assigned to Mike didn't seem to care much about putting in a good effort. I had seen Mike Other in videos and met him in person several times. Even after suffering obvious abuse while in custody, he kept insisting he was innocent. It was his eyes that struck me when I looked at him again after the verdict. In that moment, they didn't seem like the eyes of a murderer. They looked like the eyes of someone who had suffered. You need to find both of them. Those words echoed in my mind, Mike said in an interview that he had gotten out of his car and heard a young girl scream from the bushes. He ran toward the sound when he saw a flashlight flickering through the trees. He explained that a few steps from where he was found near the girls, someone hit him in the back of the head, and he fell unconscious. When he woke up, he saw two figures running back toward their cars and heard the cries of Maisie and Tina lying in front of him. Experts claimed he must have hit his head while trying to help the girls, but they declared he was guilty. Mike told us that when he reached the clearing, he found the sisters barely alive. He said Maisie couldn't crawl to him, so he had to lift her up. She told him how much she loved her sister and apologized before she passed away. At that time, no one, including myself, believed his story. As investigators examined the crime scene, a storm came in the next morning, making it tough to find any evidence. Still, there was enough to convict him. After the trial, I was celebrated as a hero. I went out for drinks, smiling as people congratulated me one after another. But Mike's eyes kept haunting me. I had heard his lawyers' sneering comments after the verdict, and while I understood the outrage over the crime, I wasn't so sure about Mike either. I couldn't accept how poorly his case was handled, no matter what he may have done. So I straightened my clothes and stood tall, determined to show Mike that although the verdict wasn't in his favor, I would remain professional. When I approached him, he was crying, which is common for someone in his situation, but I saw the tears of a broken man, not of a ruthless murderer. In that moment, I felt something different for him, something other than disgust, as I placed my hand on his shoulder. He flinched, which surprised me. But when he looked up at me, I struggled not to gasp. I wanted to let him know I didn't approve of the celebration surrounding his conviction. More than that, I wished to see if I could do something, anything to help. When I asked him if he had a message for anyone, I noticed many feelings on his face. His family and friends stood not too far behind him, part of the happy crowd celebrating his conviction. I glanced at them, feeling the joy they shared. I learned that his wife had gotten a divorce just last month. She was to put half of their shared money in a trust account, though it wasn't much if he agreed to let her new fiancé, someone who was once his close friend, adopt his teenage children. No, there was nothing left for him with them, and he knew it. As I thought back on the final day of the trial while sitting at a fancy bar with my co-workers, I remembered how paint splattered on him while his daughter yelled at him. The pain of his family's betrayal was clear on his face as he looked at them for the first time in weeks. Hours later, I suddenly felt uneasy with the people around me and the red wine I was drinking. His family planned to appear on several morning shows over the next few weeks to share their story now that Mike had been sentenced to life in prison. I felt sick and dirty, and I wasn't even part of that family. Mike's ex-wife was practically drooling over the money she might get from his conviction. Worse, his sons and daughters seemed to be caught up in it all. Sooner or later, they would become victims in this situation too, used by adults who wanted to profit from someone else's pain. I quietly left the celebration, saying I felt tired after the trial, and headed home. About 30 minutes later, I sighed as I entered my small apartment. I changed out of my suit into a comfy pair of pants and a tank top. I absent-mindedly rubbed my back where my tight bra had bothered me all day while pouring a glass of water. I moved to my chair near the window, which offered a beautiful view of the streets below and Kings Park. This was my spot for thinking in the quiet darkness of the city. On one hand, today was the best day of my career. I had successfully convicted a man named Mike in front of many news cameras. As a Crown prosecutor, I would likely be in high demand in Western Australia and maybe all of Australia for years to come. If I played my cards right, it might lead to a big promotion or even a role as a judge, and I was still only in my 30s. I took a long sip of my water, stretched out my free hand, and looked at my long fingers and nicely done nails. I knew I lived a good life, but that thought again made me think of Mike, who now would not. As I looked out the window and saw my reflection, I frowned and thought about the sad look in Mike's eyes that I couldn't forget. For the umpteenth time, I wondered if he was really innocent as he claimed. When I did my job, I used to feel good about locking up the bad guys. But this time, it felt different. This victory seemed empty to me, without the sense of justice I expected. What if we were wrong? If we made a mistake, we would have taken away the freedom of an innocent man, and the real criminal would still be out there. I sat in my favorite chair for over 2 hours, uneasy with that thought. I sipped my water and watched the late-night cars move through the streets below. The headlights of the vehicles almost formed a pattern as they navigated the roads. I reflected on my own life while I stared out the window. At 35, I was a successful woman, a well-respected lawyer, and I was financially stable. But this success came with a series of broken relationships. I almost got married twice, but those men couldn't handle my career. They liked that I was attractive and ambitious, but when things got serious, they wanted to control my choices. That wasn't something I could accept. I looked at my face in the glass again. I made a face as I thought about kids. Sure, having children might be nice, but I liked my fit body. Even now, I felt strong and attractive, and my brown hair was shiny and healthy. I hadn't found a man yet who made me want to give up my lifestyle and my hard-earned figure. I sighed. With my life, I found it easier to seek comfort through casual relationships, and when that didn't work, I had a few personal items in my drawer that could help. I scoffed at the thought. After tough cases, I often felt the urge for physical connection. I used to go out with friends, have a few drinks, and find someone to spend the night with until I felt satisfied. Sometimes it lasted just one night, and other times it went on longer. But those moments all blurred together, and none felt memorable. As I thought of Mike again and sipped my water, I noticed a car waiting at a traffic light. I surprised myself by wondering if he was okay. If he truly was guilty, he was trapped in prison for life. If he was innocent, then he faced the same fate. But I could only hope he would be treated fairly inside. No. When I thought about Mike, I realized I had no desire for a relationship, no urge to go out and drink with friends. I felt lost. The sadness in his eyes was something I couldn't forget. Mike prison was not as bad as it used to be before my trial. Now I had been found guilty and was given 2 life sentences. It was much worse. Even though I was kept away from most prisoners, I still faced regular attacks. In the first 3 weeks, I was stabbed 3 times, and not all of the people doing it were inmates. The last time I had to stay in the infirmary for 5 days. They only gave me a little medicine for the pain, and when I begged for help, the staff and guards laughed, telling me I'd be here a long time. They said someone like me wouldn't get an easy way out. Now that I was firmly behind bars, they all made it clear that my help would take a long while. The cell I was in was horrible. It was small, dull, and smelled terrible. I thought they let others use the floor before I arrived after my daily half-hour of exercise. The mattress felt like just a thin sheet on a cold metal bed, and the flickering fluorescent light seemed to hate me as much as everyone else, blinking on and off in a cruel rhythm. My food was always thrown through the door. Most of the time, it looked like it had been smashed, and sometimes it even had something on it that didn't belong. I knew they would have liked to see me eat with everyone else, but they knew I wouldn't last 5 minutes with the other prisoners, and they wanted me to suffer. After what felt like a month since my trial, I lost track of time. They finally eased up on me for a few days. The attacks stopped, and the bruises on my body began to fade. I was surprised one day when, after my exercise in the small yard for isolated prisoners, they took me back to a different cell. It was clean and had a proper bed. I looked at the TV built into the wall, and it seemed fancy to be in a room where the light didn't flicker. At first, I was anxious, sitting on the bed with my knees up, waiting for a guard to burst in or for a prisoner to come in angry. After a couple of hours, I began to relax a bit and picked up a book on the table. The title was How to Adjust to Prison Life and Rebuild Yourself. I was flipping through the pages when the door opened and the warden came in with a reporter and a camera crew. I watched in shock as the warden told the reporter and the camera how, despite my crimes, I was being treated well. He shared his hopes that, even though I was stuck in prison for life, the whole prison staff wanted me to become a good part of the prison community someday. While the warden said all this, he never asked me a single question. The guard standing by the cameraman gave me a scary look. When I glanced at him, he tightened his fists in a threatening way. I understood the warning and stayed quiet. After the warden left, the guard mocked me and tossed a thin brown envelope on the floor. "Here, Murder Mike," he said, laughing at my nickname while I kept silent. "Enjoy some reading." I heard him chuckle as he closed the door. I stayed there for a few moments, just looking at the envelope lying on the hard ground. I knew whatever was inside wouldn't be nice words from people who cared about me. Judging by how he laughed, I suspected it wasn't even a legal letter about my appeal being turned down. I had been told that my appeal would never happen no matter how much I fought for my rights. No, whatever was in that envelope was meant to hurt me. I glanced at the small camera in the corner above the door. The only private spot in my cell was the bathroom, but I was sure that if I stayed there for more than 30 seconds, the guards would break in and do something awful, leading to another trip to the infirmary. I sighed and picked up the envelope. It had a seal and a note saying that the prison staff had checked it for anything illegal. I moved to the small metal table under the light. Taking one last look at the camera, I coughed quietly, shrugged, and opened the seal. If I had thought my past life was gone for good, I was wrong. They hadn't forgotten me. They wanted to see me suffer, just as they had told me before. Inside the envelope were several papers. The first thing I saw was the signed adoption papers for each of my kids, all three of them. Leo, John, and Matilda were now adopted by my old friend, Steve Johnston. It hurt to know that even though Leo and John were over 18, they chose to cause me pain. Along with it was a marriage certificate between my ex-wife Sandra and Steve. The next envelope held pictures from their wedding, happy moments with my parents, my siblings, and my kids with Sandra and Steve. The last few pictures showed them making rude gestures and holding signs telling me to suffer. Tears filled my eyes when I saw those last images. I knew from their beatings and what happened in court that I was hated, but seeing the smiles and sneers on their faces opened a deep wound in my heart. The final envelope had personal pictures of my ex-wife and Steve, but these images were hard to look at. They were raw, and they didn't excite me at all. They had done this to make my pain even worse, so I quickly put those photos back in the envelope. The last envelope had a letter, written in Sandra's familiar handwriting. Murderer, I hope your life in prison is as hard as the warden says it is. I wish you to suffer for what you did. We all put together this package for you to make your days even worse. I have to say, I was relieved when your parents told me how proud they were of me for being with Steve for 6 months before you got caught. I didn't know how to end things with Steve, but thanks to you, I didn't have to. I'm glad to say that he makes me happier than you ever did, and it's nice that your family supports us. As I write this, I feel ashamed for ever having loved you, but my hatred for you now is much stronger than that feeling. You are disgusting, and I'm glad that we all feel this way about you. Your kids love their new dad, and we all have fun playing darts using your picture as the target. You should be proud of John. With our help, he can hit the target almost every time. The only thing that bothers me is that I had to set aside some money for you. But since you will never be able to use it, I guess it doesn't matter. Steve has a new job, and the money we earn talking about you makes up for that. The warden says they will make sure you live a long time and feel a lot of pain for what you did. That makes us all happy. Well, I have to go now because Steve is waiting for me. You never got to do that, but I know you're probably experiencing similar things where you are. At least I have what I need. Rot in hell, Murder Mike. By the end of the letter, I felt numb. I didn't even notice the guards as they came to take me back to my cell. My world felt as dark as the deepest night. My heart was heavy with sorrow and pain. If there was a light at the end of the long, dark tunnel, I was sure it would just hurt my eyes. But they weren't going to let me die. When I was thrown back into my filthy, flickering light cell, they had even taken away the bedsheets so I couldn't hurt myself. I had been beaten down, and now I chuckled silently as true sadness crept closer. I realized there was nothing left for me but a constant feeling of pain and loss that only someone who had been discarded like me could truly understand. As I endured the beatings and the mistreatment, I tried to remember that I had been their only comfort when those 2 innocent girls had passed away. I had to be strong for them. Burns, cuts, and food that even pigs wouldn't eat couldn't take that away from me, could they? Victoria free at last, because of the embarrassment and the possible legal mess that was likely on the way for all the news outlets. This story was treated as a small side note. Still, it was everywhere on TV, in newspapers, and online across the globe. Mike Other had been cleared of all charges after the real criminals, 2 of them, were caught. A police patrol had spotted their car after a notice was sent out. They pulled over the Turner brothers when they noticed they were speeding by 8 kilometers. When the police heard noises coming from the trunk of their old car, they quickly chased after them. A brief shootout allowed the police to save another victim of the brothers. It also helped solve many murders from the past 10 years, including the case of the Bustov sisters. I was following the forensic investigations closely. When they searched the car, they found a bag in the back seat full of bloody weapons, including the knife linked to the Bustov sisters. During the police questioning, which I watched from behind a glass wall, I saw the Turner brothers laughing. They even admitted how much they enjoyed having Mike Other take the blame for their crime against the sisters. These two were real psychopaths, sick and twisted. They talked proudly about their wrongdoings, including their relationship, which was deeply wrong. They described everything in detail, from how they took the girls to how they enjoyed every moment of it. Listening to them made many of us feel sick, myself included. The only good thing about hearing their twisted confessions was that their stories matched Mike's, clearing his name. They laughed as they recounted how Mike had seen them and called out to help. They bragged about knocking him out before they ran away, wiping their bloody hands on his car seats as they fled. They thought they had tricked everyone, not realizing their own DNA was also on the seats. No one looked closely enough, but the brothers enjoyed the chaos they had caused. The next day, I was there when Mike was released. While a crowd of media, family, and many onlookers waited at the main entrances of the prison, Mike was quietly brought out through a different building to a waiting car. I gasped when I saw him. Although Mike was never a big man, after his time in prison, he looked almost like a skeleton. He had only spent 8 months inside. I could easily see the bruises and burns on his arms. His face had fresh scars that looked like they hadn't healed properly. He looked thin and very weak, like he had gone through a lot and was deeply troubled. As federal agents brought him outside, he paused for a moment and started to look around. Suddenly, our eyes met, and everything around me faded away. I felt a dry tightness in my throat, almost like I couldn't breathe as we shared that moment. Even though we were close enough to talk, I couldn't say anything. I felt too ashamed about my part in what had happened to him. I struggled to breathe, but after what felt like a long time, I managed to swallow and quietly say, "I found them." I tried to smile, but his sad expression stopped me. Surprisingly, when he looked at me, I didn't see anger in his eyes. There wasn't much there, but there was a moment of recognition. He smiled back at me when he understood what I meant. He nodded and held my gaze while the agents and nervous guards got his car ready. My phone rang, but I didn't take my eyes off him as I answered the call. "Vicky," my boss Tony said. "Tony, I'm here," I replied. "I knew you would be." "Where are they taking him?" I asked. "To a safe house for witnesses. It's too dangerous for him to be anywhere else right now," Tony said. I swallowed hard while watching the car drive away. "I want to talk to him," I told my boss. "Is that a good idea, Victoria?" "You put him in prison," he replied. "I don't care," I said firmly. "That man has suffered so much, and we all played a part in it. If I have to do whatever it takes to help him, I will." I paused again. "You didn't see his eyes, Tony. You don't understand." There was an uncomfortable silence as I couldn't finish my thought. "I get it, Victoria. We all know you're a big reason he's being released. Let me see what I can do," my boss said before hanging up. The next day, I sat with my friend, Terrence Larkins, on a sofa in the safe house with Mike Other sitting across from us. Mike was wrapped in bandages, both of his arms, most of his right leg, and I could see some bandages under his shorts on the left side. There was gauze over wounds on his face, and a tube was attached to his left hand for a drip. I guessed the bag contained pain medicine because when he moved, I could see he was in a lot of discomfort. But his eyes were alert, even if they darted around the room, taking in everything and everyone quickly. In the background, by the kitchen table, a federal agent watched us. I knew there were 2 others somewhere else in the house. On the table was a half-eaten ham and cheese sandwich. After a moment, Mike noticed me staring at his sandwich. "You can have it if you're hungry, Miss Brown," he said. "I can't eat much anymore. Real food doesn't sit well with me," he added with a shrug. "Real food?" Terrence said, looking at the sandwich with a hint of disgust. "Mike, what did they feed you?" Terrence and I glanced at the agent listening in, and he looked back at us with an unreadable face. "I don't know," Mike replied. "Most of the time it was leftovers, but they were usually old and dirty." He chuckled, but it sounded harsh, more like a strange creature. Then he coughed, and I could hear something strange in his chest. I felt a wave of sadness for him, someone I had helped put in this situation. I couldn't look away from his sad face. "Anyway, we will talk about that later," Terrence said, clearing his throat while I tried to hold back my emotions. Before Terrence could say anything else, Mike turned to me. "You really got them?" he asked, his eyes pleading. I noticed his gaze had stopped moving and was focused on me. I couldn't help it. I leaned over the table and placed my hand on his. Tears started falling down my face. "Yes, Mike, we got them. Both of them. They will never hurt anyone again," I said, my voice shaking. Mike nodded, though I could see he was battling his own feelings. He started, looking at me with even more intensity. "Do I have to go back?" "What?" I exclaimed. "Mike, why would you say that? You're innocent. Why would you think you have to go back to that place?" "I don't know, he said, looking at me sadly. "They told me I had to go back." "Who?" Terrence asked, suddenly worried, his voice sharper. "The agents?" He was referring to the federal agents watching him. He glanced at the agent standing at the back of the room, who suddenly looked uneasy. Mike shook his head. "No, the warden and the guards told me. Big Larry also said I need to go back because the warden wouldn't let him have a new person as easily this time." I could see the panic in his eyes, even though his voice sounded flat. He truly believed he would be sent back to prison. I felt anger rising in me. We not only locked up an innocent man, but we also harmed him. I began to doubt the prison system. Nothing is perfect, but what they did to the frail man before me, guilty or innocent, was wrong. "Mike," I started, but Terrence placed his arm on mine. "I'm sorry, Victoria," he said. "Could you and the agent please wait outside for a few minutes? I need to talk to Mike alone for a bit." I held back my angry words. This was why I had brought Terrence along. After I promised the agent that Mike would be safe with Terrence, I stepped out of the room and closed the door. I felt my world and my sense of right and wrong slipping away from me. Mike. Today in the news, well-known Crown prosecutor Miss Victoria Brown has secured the conviction of the Turner brothers, who are serial killers. They received multiple life sentences for over 15 murders committed in the past decade. Their capture helped clear the name of Mr. Mike Other. The report went on for several more minutes, with doctors and crime experts discussing why the brothers did what they did. These were the same experts who had looked into my life over 2 years ago during my trial. I scoffed and turned off the TV, tossing the remote onto the table in front of me. I looked outside, enjoying the view from my balcony. I closed my eyes and took a few deep breaths, as my therapist had taught me. I could hear the ocean in the distance, and it helped to calm me. These days, I felt almost normal when I looked in the mirror. After the painful experience of being wrongly accused and mistreated in prison, it took months of counseling for me to feel at ease in my own skin, especially around more than 1 or 2 people. The day Terrence talked to me and, at Victoria's suggestion, became my lawyer was a turning point. I often thought that Victoria knew exactly what she was doing when she brought him to meet me. Terrence worked for one of Australia's top law firms and was eager to take on my case. Shortly after our first meeting, he began suing all the news outlets that labeled me a murderer before the court had made its ruling. There were many outlets involved. He also filed suits against those that used my name without proper sources before the charges were made public. I was shocked when most media outlets settled out of court for significant sums. Terrence explained that they knew facing a trial where I was innocent and wrongly accused would cost them even more. It didn't take long for them to agree to settle, and in the end I received just under $84 million from over 30 different media companies after paying Terrence his share. The money I received meant I would never have to work again if I didn't want to, and my lawyer was quite pleased with the outcome. After what I had suffered in prison, my lawyer, Terrence, made a deal with the government. In exchange for dropping my lawsuit against them, I got more than I expected. I wouldn't have to pay taxes again, and I would get a huge refund at the end of each year. Plus, I received great travel perks for myself and my close family, allowing us to visit anywhere in the country at no cost. As a bonus, the warden and nearly all the guards who had treated me poorly while I was inside lost their jobs or were lowered in rank while they faced investigations. It was likely that some of those prison staff would end up in trouble and experience what they had put me through. Also, to keep me safe, the government agreed to change my name. Now, I was officially Joel Masters, a retired banker who had made money from the stock market. It wasn't the whole truth, but in my new town, most people knew me only as Joel. The person who helped me the most was the mayor, Douglas Monitor, of the local council. After Terrence helped me get my first settlement, Doug reached out to offer me a new home, away from the trouble of my past. Doug had his own reasons to help me. His brother was wrongly accused of a serious crime long ago. Sadly, Doug's brother didn't survive prison. It was only a year after his brother's death that Doug finally learned the truth and cleared his brother's name. Doug wanted to do for me what he couldn't do for his brother, so he and Terrence found me over 500 acres of land by the beach, close to the town of 1770. This land was supposed to become a resort in a decade, but now it was mine. I bought the land, and since I didn't have to pay taxes, it cost me much less than usual. The property was mostly made up of Australian bushes and beach plants. If you've seen the Australian coast, you know the area. Sand dunes with tough little trees, further back transitioning into gum trees and grassy spaces. There was one small paved road that led to the property, hardly anything else around. It took me about 6 months to get everything settled after taking possession of the land. During that time, I stayed in a nice motorhome that Terrence arranged for me. First, they cleared and leveled over 5 acres of land. Then, they built my 3-story house. Terrence hired the best engineers and builders. They used a lot of glass, strong steel, and polished wood to create a house that felt more like a small resort. The great thing was that my deals with the government lowered the cost to much less than usual for such a big building. On the ground floor, there was a large open space. It had a lounge with enough sofas for almost 20 people, a formal dining area with enough seats for 12 more, and a kitchen with all the latest appliances. There were 3 sinks, and the walk-in pantry was so big it could be like a kitchen on its own. I also had a big study with a 2-bedroom guest area nearby in case I had visitors. On the second floor, there were 4 large bedrooms. Each one was big enough to be called a master bedroom, with its own bathroom and lovely views of the ocean. There was also a big game room with a pool table and a wall full of books with a cozy reading spot where I could sit and choose from many books while looking out at the beach. The top floor was the master suite. It was so spacious that there were no walls between the bedroom and the bathroom. The big closet had a bench in the middle, and I even had my own deck outside, which included a large hot tub just for me. When Terrence and the architect first showed me the plans, I was shocked. I had no idea what to do with such a huge house. But with excitement in his eyes, Terrence reminded me that I deserved something special after spending time in a tiny cell. I agreed, but only if there were no bright fluorescent lights in the whole house. Since my house was far from any utilities, I had a small solar farm set up on a rise about 500 meters away. It produces enough power to keep everything running for almost a week without sunlight. I also had a generator in a utility shed with enough fuel to run for another month without needing to get more supplies from town. Finally, I made sure the property had several safety features. There was an electric fence running all around, powered by its own solar system. The property was surrounded by security gates and cameras, and while it didn't officially have a basement, there was a hidden room underground for emergencies. I didn't own the beach in front of my house, but since I was a bit away from the busy tourist area and my nearest neighbors were over 10 minutes away, I had a nice escape from the world. I could choose to stay away from people when I wanted to. After I was free and for the next few months, many of my relatives tried to contact me. When they couldn't reach me, they often called Terrence. I ignored my close family, my parents, siblings, and children, because they had hurt me too much. I did agree to meet some cousins and distant relatives, but only if I felt safe, and we always met at Terrence's office. If they mentioned getting back together with my immediate family, I politely said no. If they insisted, I chose not to talk to them again. One nice surprise was meeting Robbie and Amy Other. They were distant relatives, separated from me by many generations and marriages, but they understood my feelings. Robbie's family had betrayed him too. I remembered that Robbie was once a skilled fighter. They lived a few hours away on the Sunshine Coast with their children. I enjoyed spending afternoons with them, sometimes at my place and sometimes at theirs. I also found out that Amy ran a successful investment company called Alro. I was able to invest with her and got some great returns. Not having to pay taxes on that money helped me keep a good amount in my bank account. Another person I spent time with was Victoria. I didn't really know why she wanted to be around me so much. At first, I thought it was because she felt guilty about her role in my past troubles. She soon admitted that she felt quite a bit of that guilt. But as she helped me make choices during those early days, our relationship grew into something more. At the start, if I couldn't tell whether something was good or bad for me, I often ended up leaving the room without saying a word. When new people spoke to me, I would freeze up. I found comfort in turning to Victoria for advice, asking if a situation was a good idea or if a person was nice. Besides Terrence, who was my lawyer and therapist, she was the first person I trusted again. As we became friends, we started to talk about the trial and everything that had happened. However, if anyone else brought it up, I felt my anxiety rise, even with my therapist. But for some reason, I felt comfortable with Victoria. While we talked and watched my house being built, she told me that it was my eyes during the court trial that made her want to follow up on my statement about finding the Turner brothers. She blushed and looked away when she said it was her mission to see my eyes shine again. It was a surprising friendship. After my release, one of the first people I saw was Victoria. She was as upset as I was when she saw me so broken after the guilty verdict. From that day at the safe house, it felt like Victoria was there for me almost every other day. She arranged for Terrence to be my lawyer, and she set up a counselor to help me. She had no idea about the deal I made with the media or the government, but she found an accountant for me, knowing I would be getting some sort of money. Even though Victoria had a hand in my fall from grace, she was never my enemy. Just as quickly as she helped bring me down, she was also the first to help me back up. I was surprised to see that while she was working to prosecute me, she was also looking for the Turner brothers. Later, when her boss showed me pictures of her office filled with files and question marks, I realized that Victoria had always doubted my guilt. I managed to catch snippets of the trial against the Turner brothers, but I could only watch for a few minutes at a time. In what I did see, she never let her anger overflow. Still, the tension in her stance and the way she cut off the cruel words from the guilty men revealed her true feelings. Unlike the day my verdict was announced, there was no celebration when the Turner brothers were found guilty. Victoria held everyone accountable, even the judge. The media took note of how she conducted herself, and requests for interviews were turned down. Articles about her personal life quickly disappeared. No one wanted to upset Victoria Brown for fear of her anger. However, she was different during her visits to me, which happened every few weeks. One Friday, not long after I moved into my new house, I went for a run. Halfway through, I tripped over a piece of rotten driftwood hidden in the sand. I fell and landed on some rough pebbles, scraping my arm. It hurt a little and was bleeding, but it wasn't serious. When I got home, I found that Victoria had come to visit. She was one of the very few people who had access to my property and my house. She was one of my few friends, and if I was honest, I would say she was my best friend. When I walked in, I saw her bags next to the door and heard the shower running. She must have just arrived a few minutes ago. I went into the kitchen to get the first aid kit and clean up my scrape. As I was working on that, Victoria came out and spotted me. "Hey, Mike, how—" she started, but then she saw my bleeding arm. "Oh no, Mike, are you okay?" She forgot her greeting. She hurried over to me, cleaned my arm, and wrapped it in gauze and a bandage. I tried not to look too much because in her rush she hadn't put on a top. Being polite, I didn't want to stare. "There," she said, happy with her work. "We can check this again tomorrow." She looked at me and noticed I was blushing. "Mike, what's wrong?" she asked, sounding a bit worried. She looked confused for a moment, then glanced down. She blushed too, but also seemed a little playful. "I'm sorry, Mike. I didn't mean to make you uncomfortable." We both felt a bit embarrassed for a bit longer, but then we fell back into our usual conversation. She asked about my work with the prison release program. After receiving a settlement and getting free flights, I started volunteering to help non-violent prisoners get back on track after being released. I spent a few days each month traveling to help, meeting with parole boards and working with those just out of prison to help them find jobs and services. I found it helpful to support these people as they adjusted back into society. Sometimes I would keep in touch with them for a long time. They called me Murder Mike, but treated me like a hero. The government liked this approach because it helped reduce the chances of them getting in trouble again. Victoria and I also chatted about life back in Perth. She would ask about my counseling sessions, and all in all, it felt like a normal friendship built on some tough experiences. One evening, after watching highlights of her big case against the Turner brothers, she flew in late, right after the trial ended. I made us a spiced Moroccan chicken dinner on the grill on my deck. I had done this before, and I knew she liked the flavors. I wanted her to feel safe and warm. For the first part of the evening, we didn't talk much. We were both thinking about the trial. As we sat outside in the evening air, we could hear the waves crashing on the shore. The sound was both calming and exciting. Victoria sighed as we enjoyed the noise after dinner. "Mike, I quit my job today," Victoria said out of the blue. "I'm sorry, you what?" I said, stopping my glass of wine halfway to my mouth. "I quit my job today," she repeated, looking out at the ocean. A cargo ship's lights flickered slowly in the distance. "Why?" I asked. "Victoria, you're great at your job. Why would you do that?" "Because I'm not great at my job. Look at what happened with you," she said, her voice shaky. I could see her shoulders drop as she felt the weight of the moment. "We've talked about this," I said. "You did what you were supposed to do. You did your best with the evidence you had." "I know, Mike, but—" she started to respond. "No," I interrupted gently. "Victoria, you have won cases with less evidence before. You really nailed those Turner brothers." "But Mike," she said, looking at me with hope. I went on, "You never gave up. You knew something was wrong with my case even while doing your job. Your boss, Tony, shouldn't have shown me everything, but he did. Even after the sentence, you kept investigating. Victoria, you were likely the only one who believed I could be innocent when everyone else wanted me to pay for what happened." "I heard about what you did with the prison staff after my release," I said, stopping her from putting herself down again. "It wasn't just Terrence. It was you." She nodded, tears still in her eyes. "So why would you quit?" I asked. For a few minutes we were quiet. I stood up, walked around the table, pulled out another chair and sat across from her. I took her hands in mine and waited for her to look at me. "Why?" I asked again. "This case. You broke me," she said. "Before you, I was on track to be the youngest person to lead the state Supreme Court. I dreamed of putting criminals in jail and getting justice for families. I was determined. I was young and attractive, and all the guys wanted to date me. All the judges were pleased when I was the prosecutor. I had it all." "You still do," I told her. "You're still doing that. You got real justice for the bust-offs. If it wasn't for you, the Turner brothers might have gotten away with their wrongdoings for a long time. You are a strong and powerful woman, Victoria. Despite everything I have faced, you are the one who brought justice for that family and all the families affected by their actions. So why would you want to resign?" Victoria nodded and wiped her eyes with her sleeve. "I understand, Mike. I really do. Everyone is telling me how amazing I am. And you are right. In some ways, I am getting justice. But Mike..." I looked at her. "I don't want to do this anymore," she said, her voice firm. I leaned back, but she still held my hands. "What do you want to do?" I asked after a moment. "I want..." She hesitated, Mike. "I would like to stay here with you. Would that be okay?" Her eyes were earnest. Sure," I replied, swallowing hard. "I can pay rent. That's not a problem. But I need to get away. I need to find out what it feels like to be a true person again." I laughed gently. "Victoria, you are the most real person I know. But I understand wanting to escape. You can stay here as long as you need and forget about rent. My friends don't pay." The rest of the evening felt light and a bit awkward, but I could see that Victoria felt relieved that I would let her stay while she figured things out. Victoria. "So how long has that been happening?" Sylvia Monitor, Doug's wife, asked me as we enjoyed the evening. "I was flying back to Perth tomorrow after asking Mike if I could live with him for a few days, and I was thrilled he had said yes. We had been invited to the Monitor's house because they like to keep Mike social when I wasn't around. The four of us had just finished a delicious lamb roast. While Mike and Doug cleared the table, Sylvia and I poured ourselves a bottle of port and 4 glasses, waiting for the guys in their fancy lounge. Then she gave me a knowing look and asked her question. "What?" I replied, trying not to meet her gaze. "That look," Sylvia said, raising an eyebrow. "I've been watching you all night, Victoria. The way you look at Mike isn't just as a friend, there's more to it." I felt my cheeks turn red, realizing I had been caught. "You love him, don't you?" she asked, not waiting for my answer. I couldn't hide it anymore. She had seen through my feelings. I just nodded. Sylvia set down the port and glasses and led me outside. "Talk to me," she said as we stepped out onto their balcony. "At first," I explained, "I thought it was just guilt. Everyone wanted him to pay a heavy price for what happened, and I was the one responsible for making that happen. I felt so powerless that day in court. Even though I explained everything well to get a conviction, I knew I had made a mistake. When he was declared innocent, I was filled with joy, and right after that, Mike trusted me enough to let me help him start over. I think that's something special. In him, I see a strength that surprises me given his smaller size. If there was a test of strength, I believe he could last longer than Superman." Sylvia waited for me to keep talking. She only nodded slightly. "I really thought he would push me away at any moment," I explained. "In court, I was tough on him to do my job. But even though he was losing, he never gave up. The world tried to crush him, but he kept his head high. He never said he was guilty, even when it might have made his time in prison easier." "I have come to admire him, Sylvia. He is hurt and has lost a lot of what makes him human, but he uses what he has left to help others. As one of the few who gets to see the real him, how can I not have feelings for him?" I leaned over the balcony railing while Sylvia placed a comforting hand on my back. "Feelings for who?" I heard Mike say. I turned in shock to see Doug and Mike standing in the doorway, each with a glass of port. Sylvia walked over to Doug and took a glass from him without a word, drawing him inside and leaving Mike and me alone on the balcony. It felt awkward. With a shaky hand, I took the glass from Mike. I looked into his eyes and saw the sadness there again. He swallowed hard. "You're having feelings?" he asked, his voice tense. I nodded. Mike leaned on the railing where I had just been. Doug and Sylvia's home had a lovely view, but as Mike rested there, I could see his shoulders droop. "He's the luckiest guy in the world, Victoria. Honestly," he said, trying to sound brave while emotions swirled inside him. "Who is this lucky guy?" he asked. He didn't realize it. The poor guy thought there was another man, and it hurt him. As he looked at me, I did the only thing I could think of. I leaned closer and placed my hand on his cheek. I gazed into his eyes and smiled. Over the years, I have had several relationships. Each was different, and each man felt unique. Most were in the legal field and often had an air of arrogance, dressed in fancy suits and cologne, acting like they would take care of the little woman. I even almost married twice. But deep down, I knew it would never work. We would never be true partners because I couldn't be open with them, and they couldn't be open with me either. But right now, in this moment, as I gently pressed my lips to the man in front of me, this broken but strong man made my heart open up. I had known for a long time that I was falling in love with Mike. It started that day in court when he was sentenced, and I struggled with the awkward feeling about what we had all done to him. But now, as I felt his lips on mine, I knew I was right. The kiss was gentle. I remembered a few months ago when Mike got embarrassed. He didn't want to look down my shirt while I was helping him with a scrape he got while running on the beach. In that moment, I could see how much he cared for me. I hadn't meant to make him blush, but his shyness affected me too. I felt excited, just like I did with that kiss. But then we pulled back. He looked confused. "Victoria, what?" he asked, stumbling over his words. I smiled and took hold of his shirt sleeve. I pulled him closer and gave him a quick kiss on the lips. Even this little action made me feel nervous. I really wanted him, but I knew he was hurt and it would take time for him to heal. I knew he received a good amount of money from the media. I wasn't sure how much, but it had to be enough. I thought that if I added my savings, which was a couple of $1,000,000, to his, we might not need to work again. I wanted to love this man for the rest of my life if he would let me. "You heard me. I'm falling in love with you," I said again with a smile. "Why, Victoria? Why me? What have I done to deserve this?" he asked. I could see he was doubting himself again. His struggles made him feel unworthy. "Mike?" I sat down beside him at a small table and took his hands, just like he had done the other evening. He looked at me, his face showing a mix of hope and sadness. "Mike, you need to know it's true. I am falling in love with you," I said again to make sure he understood. I watched as he swallowed. He nodded, but I could see the fear in his eyes, so I held his hands tighter. "Talk to me, Mike," I said. Honestly, I was worried. I had never felt so open before. I had told a man I loved him. Usually it was the other way around. His worried look told me he was ready to run. "Please," I begged softly. We looked at each other for a moment, and although he looked away, I felt his grip on my hands grow stronger. "I'm scared, Victoria. I'm so terrified right now to believe that someone cares for me, let alone says they love me," he whispered. I stayed quiet and waited. I needed to be patient and let him think. "When you said you were falling in love, I felt like my whole world was about to fall apart again. My first thought was to just send me back to prison." I gasped. He continued. "I mean, how can someone say they love me? I'm Murder Mike," he said with worry and frustration. I opened my mouth to speak, but then he raised a hand, pausing for a moment before putting it back down on mine, squeezing my arm and giving me a weak smile. "I know, exonerated, not guilty," he said, interrupting what I was about to say. "But that doesn't mean I don't carry those scars every day. There were times inside, after a beating or something even worse, when I almost believed it myself. I wondered if I had." "No, Mike, no," I said, my voice cracking, hurt that he could even think such a thing. "I know, Victoria," he said, giving me a sad smile. "But the mind can play tricks on you if you mess with it long enough, and mine was messed with by a lot of people for a long time." He noticed my expression. "Yes, even you. But you were never cruel," he sighed. "We've talked about this. What I mean is, if there's anyone I'd want to be loved by, it would be you." I smiled, feeling a rush of excitement. He must have felt it too, because he smiled back. "But I'm struggling to accept it," he said, looking at me again. I could see my happiness turn into worry. "When you said love, I have to admit I don't know how to take it. My last love broke me. They all hurt me while I was in custody." I nodded. I had heard his family bragging about how they harmed him. I even spoke to the judge about getting a protection order against them. "I'm scared," he said again. "What if—" He couldn't finish his thought. "What if it happened again? Would I stand by you?" I said for him. He nodded, swallowing hard. The man I loved needed support. He needed to know I would always be there for him. "Then I would ask you. I would ask what happened, and if you did it. But no matter what, Mike, I would stand by you because I see who you really are. You're not a murderer. I'm here for you 100%, and if you allow it, you'll have my love forever." With that, Mike broke down, falling to his knees, his tears falling onto our hands. After a few minutes, I leaned down and pulled him into an awkward hug. When he looked up a moment later, he gently wiped away my tears with his thumb. Our lips met, and this time I felt his emotions wash over me. Even though I was taller than him, he pulled me onto his lap and we kissed again. We spent about half an hour outside on Doug and Sylvia's balcony, talking softly. Mike wouldn't say he loved me, but I knew he felt it. He just needed time to say the words. Mike. That weekend with Victoria, it felt like a dam broke inside me. For a long time, I had kept myself from feeling good. I found joy in watching others reach their goals. But when it came to my own happiness, I believed I didn't deserve it. When Victoria said she loved me, the walls I had built up started to break down at last. Victoria had 6 weeks left in her job before she needed to return to Perth, but she promised me we would talk every day. I met with my therapist, who smiled and congratulated me for being brave enough to start a new relationship. When I told him that Victoria felt the same way about me, he looked really happy. He was excited because Victoria had recommended him, so he already knew her a little bit. We talked about my feelings, and he assured me it was okay to accept Victoria's love. He encouraged me to sort through my thoughts and be open to returning those feelings. He didn't push me. Instead, he showed me different ways to think about my emotions. Did I love her? I was scared to think about that. I was definitely drawn to her. She had been there for me through tough times. She witnessed my worst moments, held me when I felt overwhelmed, and never judged me even when I complained about my pain. Victoria just took it all and always made me feel accepted during my recovery. She kept her promise. She called every day. We had long conversations about her moving here with me. We talked a lot about our relationship. Several times, she carefully told me she loved me, and I shared that I cared for her a lot. I knew she wanted to hear, "I love you" from me, and it would come, but we both understood I wasn't quite there yet. I spent my days thinking on the beach in front of my house. One of the things I grew to love was fishing. Doug helped me get a surf rod and the right gear, so now I often cast my lines into the water and enjoyed the sound of the waves. On one of these days, I set up a beach chair under an umbrella with 3 rods in the water when Terrence called me. "Hey, Mike," my lawyer's voice came through. "Terrence, how are you, my friend?" I heard my lawyer laugh softly. It's not often I hear that word from clients. I chuckled back. "True, but you're one of the few people who's really helped me." Silence followed. "No, I mean it, Terrence," I said. "I know you and your firm have made a lot of money from me. I remember you getting upset with the media for how much more I could have made if things had gone differently." Terrence laughed now. "But Terrence, you call me at least once a week. You've brought your wife and kids to visit here 4 times in the past 6 months. A regular lawyer wouldn't do that." "Nah," he chuckled. "I just get a free family vacation on the beach a few times a year. It's really just for me." We both laughed. "But thank you, Mike," he said quietly. "Really, it means a lot to me. Besides the money, Constance and I see you as a friend, and hearing that back from you matters." I glanced at my fishing rod on the far side. The tip was twitching like it had a bite. "So enough of this mushy stuff," Terrence said as I reached for the line and laughed. "Business call, I guess?" I asked. "Sort of," he replied, and I could hear he was unsure. "It's not about my old family again, is it?" I asked. Over the last few months, my kids had been asking Terrence where I was. It felt like they were always sharing their sad stories and saying sorry for their past actions. "No," Terrence said softly. "This time it's about Mary and Garland Bustoff." He paused for a moment as I steadied the rod in my hands. Yes, there was definitely a bite on the line. He knew I was listening as I felt the fishing line click. "Mike?" "Yeah," I answered, the word coming out with a tired sigh. "They want to meet. They asked to do it privately here in the office." We paused again. I reeled in the line a bit, taking up the slack. "This is what, their 17th request?" I asked quietly. "19th, he replied. "But this time they have a plan. They want to formally apologize to you. And Mike." I lifted the line as I felt another tug. "Yeah," I said. "I think you should meet with them, at least for your own sake. How about I set it up a couple of weeks from now?" "Sure," I said, jerking the rod. But I felt the line go loose. The fish hadn't taken the bait. Victoria. I was nervously tapping my little finger on the side of my coffee cup. It had been almost a month since I saw Mike. We talk every day, but today feels different. As I wrap up my job, I've been busy. I miss Mike deeply, and I know in my heart how great it will be when we're together full-time. But at the same time, I realize how much it hurts to be away from someone you love for so long. In the past, being far apart didn't feel this hard. But ever since that night, I just want to be in the same room with him, if nothing else. Mike's flight landed about 5 minutes ago, and I'm waiting at the airport for him to come in. Today, he's coming to meet with Terrence about a few things, but he's also going to see the Bustoffs. Terrence has met with them several times, and so have I. What happened to them was terrible. Even though I don't have kids, I know I would never want to go through what they did. After the courtroom events, right after Mike was cleared, they reached out to anyone who could help them connect with him, including me. I gently suggested they talk to Terrence, but they hit a wall there. It's a big deal that Mike agreed to meet them later today, and I worry about how he will handle it. Since I confessed my feelings for him, I've felt nervous almost all the time. I only saw him once more, 2 weeks after I told him I was falling for him. I wanted him to hold me close and make me feel special, but I knew it wouldn't happen like that. He was still a broken man. During that weekend together, we walked along the beach hand in hand and cuddled on the couch watching movies. We shared some sweet kisses, and my feelings for him grew even stronger. Mike was not better or worse than me. He was my true partner. someone I could trust with my heart, knowing he would cherish it forever. Just thinking about him and knowing I would see him soon made me a bit anxious. I knew today would be hard for him, but I already planned to take him out for dinner after his meeting with the Bustoffs. It was unlikely anyone would recognize him now. He looked great, fit and toned, with a shaved head and face, sun-kissed skin, and colored contacts. He was so different from the skinny, pale guy he was before. I was lost in my thoughts when I felt a shadow above me. I looked up to see a woman a few years younger than me, someone I sort of recognized. "Miss Brown?" she said carefully. I nodded and stood up, feeling a little worried. I glanced back towards the runway, trying not to show my nervousness. "Miss Other, right?" I replied, trying to stay professional. The woman nodded. "Patricia," she said, confirming her name as Mike's sister. "What can I help you with, Patricia?" I asked, feeling anxious as a plane rolled toward the gate. "I'm a little desperate, but I'm sure you remember my brother?" she asked. I tried not to laugh. "Of course, I could never forget him," I replied, keeping my face neutral. Patricia looked down, her expression serious. "I was wondering if you've heard anything. If you know—" She trailed off. Neither of us spoke for a moment. "I mean, after what we all did to him, I was hoping you'd know how to—" She couldn't finish her thought. "You want to know if I can help you get in touch with your brother?" I said for her. I sighed. "Miss Other," I said, trying to sound serious. "You, your brothers, your mother, and almost your whole family were part of one of the biggest mistakes in justice this country has seen." Patricia nodded slowly. "When it all happened, you didn't even ask him if he was innocent. His mother, father, sister, brothers, wife, children, and friends all turned their backs on him. You and your mother even lashed out at him." Patricia was crying now, but she needed to hear this. "When he was sentenced," I continued, trying to hold back my own tears, "I was in the room. I was the one who helped put him away. As an innocent man was punished, I felt terrible. I couldn't link the crime to the facts I had. In a moment of kindness, I asked him if he had a message for anyone. He shook his head. I took a risk and looked back at the gallery. I saw you and your family celebrating his downfall. You didn't seem to care that your brother had been found guilty of a terrible crime. You were happy." I paused as a few people were watching us. I could see the shame on her face. "Your brother needed to get away from everyone and everything. He was given the chance to start fresh. If you truly cared about him, you should let him go." Looking into the eyes of the man I cared for's sister, I saw tears forming. There was a hint of regret in her eyes, but also a sense of urgency that wasn't about Mike. "But how can we apologize? How can we make things right? How can we get him to forgive us if we can't see him? His lawyer only tells us that Mike doesn't want to see us. His kids are searching every day for him. If you looked at their searches, finding their dad is their main concern. They are still receiving help for what happened. How will we ever be forgiven?" "Miss Brown, can you help us?" Patricia pleaded. I hurt my brother a lot. I wish I could go back and protect him. How can I make him forgive me? We have been looking all over the country for him. I'm waiting for Clayton, my brother. We heard he might be in Brisbane, so Clayton has spent the last week checking out reports. But he hasn't found him." She finished speaking and looked down at her feet, feeling ashamed. "Do you know there's a restraining order against all of you from seeing him?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. "I know, Miss Brown, trust me, we all know. But we're desperate," she replied. I glanced back to see the plane finishing its taxi. "Why are you so desperate, Patricia? What good will seeing your brother do except cause him more pain?" I asked. I didn't want to connect Mike to his family at all. I realized that talking to Patricia was risky. "We haven't seen him since the trial," Patricia said. "If Mike could forgive us and tell everyone he has, then we could go back to how things were." "Go back to how things were?" I asked, a bit annoyed. "What do you mean by that?" "We're outcasts in our own neighborhood, Miss Brown. No one wants to be with us since we treated Mike so badly. My parents get bothered everywhere they go. I face trouble at work, and Clayton's kids get picked on." I shrugged. "I understand that," I replied. "You didn't just hurt your brother. You joined in the whole chaos. Even if he was guilty, your actions would come back to haunt you." "We see that now," she said sadly. "So let me get this straight. I said, standing tall as the airport staff began getting the passengers ready to exit. After everything you did to your brother, you want to find him and say sorry so he'll tell the media he forgives you? I asked in disbelief. You make it sound terrible when you say it like that, she said, her eyes downcast. That's because it is, Patricia. Thinking that your main reason is to ease your own feelings is wrong. I sighed as the airport staff opened the walkway doors. Look, Patricia, the best thing I can tell you is to think about why you want to talk to your brother. Once you understand your reasons, talk with his lawyer to make formal contact. She nodded. Thank you, Miss Brown, she said, her sadness clear on her face. We're desperate, and I thought since you know him from the trial— I understand, Patricia, I replied. Noticing movement, I saw Mike coming out from the walkway, and I quickly ran to him and hugged him tightly. As he reached for his glasses, I pulled him close for a brief touch of affection. Joel, welcome back. It's great to see you, I said and added. I think you're going to really like the surprise when I introduce you to an old friend from home. Mike suddenly seemed cautious and kissed me back, knowing I had just used one of our special words for danger. I saw his eyes looking around behind his sunglasses, and his lips got tighter when they landed on his sister. Thanks, honey, he said, trying to sound relaxed. It's great to see you. I smiled because I knew that part was true. Let's get out of here, he said, and linked his arm with mine. As we walked past Patricia, I glanced at her. She was staring at us, but not in a friendly way. With Mike's clean-shaven head, toned muscles, and new clothes, she didn't recognize him. My loud calling him Mike by his new name, Joel, hopefully threw her off the track. Neither of us spoke until we reached the waiting car, which was going to take us straight to Terrence's office. Vicky, what the— he started to ask. I know, babe, I said, glancing at the driver quickly. She shocked me. Apparently your brother was on that flight and they are looking for you. Why? He asked. I finally let out a sigh about his family that I had been holding back. No one was going to hurt my man again if I could help it. That bad? He asked. Yeah, I replied. They want to find you to say sorry, but really, it's just so that they can get everyone off their backs. It's not about fixing things. I heard him sigh again. There isn't much chance of that, he said, taking his turn to look at the driver. I can still feel her slaps. My cheek still stings when I remember it. You called me honey? I said when I pulled back to my seat. Yeah, Mike said, smiling at me. Did you miss me? He asked. I looked at him shyly. Uh-huh, I said. I could feel that he was becoming more confident again. We flirted for the rest of the ride. I don't think he realized how much he was affecting me by the time we stepped out of the car. I quickly excused myself to go to the restroom almost as soon as we got into Terrence's office. Mike! The past month had been tough. Victoria and I were getting closer. We spent hours talking, and I loved that she was so understanding. She was the most patient person I had ever met. I could feel myself falling for her fast. I watched as we signed in at Terrence's office, then she excused herself to the bathroom. As I watched her walk away, the way she moved stirred feelings in me, just like it had many times over the past month. Terrence came to greet us not long after Victoria returned and led us both into a big conference room. His assistant walked in and took our coffee orders before closing the door behind us. Terrence tapped a big folder filled with papers and looked at both of us. Okay, what's going on? He asked. What do you mean, Terrence? Victoria replied, acting innocent, even though she understood him well. He turned to me, and I just smiled back. I've known you both for a while, and I've never— He paused, looking at us, then grinned. You two? He said, pointing at each of us. Victoria nodded. How long? He asked. It's been gradual. I spoke up before Victoria could respond. We're just taking things one step at a time. Well, good for you, Terrence said, still smiling. We chatted for a few more minutes, and Terrence explained what to expect for today's meeting. There were no legal matters involved. It was just a chance for grieving parents to express their regret. A few minutes before the meeting, Terrence's assistant came in and led us to a smaller, nicely decorated room with a couple of couches. When we entered, I was surprised to see Mary and Garland Bustoff already sitting there. As Terrence, Victoria, and I walked in, they greeted Terrence and then Victoria. When they reached out to shake my hand, they paused, realizing it was me, Mike Other. They were meeting, not just another lawyer. Immediately, Mary became emotional, saying she was sorry repeatedly. I let them express how they felt. Out of everyone, these two had the best reason to dislike me after my conviction. When I was found innocent, they waited a year to reach out to me. If they wanted to show their regret, they deserved the chance more than anyone else. "Mr. and Mrs. Bustoff," I said as we all took our seats. They sat on a couch while I sat on another one, and Terence and Victoria sat on chairs by the wall. I knew Victoria wanted to sit close to me, and I wished she would hold my hand. But for now, I needed to handle this on my own. "Please, Mr. Other, call us Garland and Mary," Garland Bustoff said, speaking for the first time. I nodded in agreement. "I know many people have tried to express their apologies to you," Garland said softly. "This includes us, so I won't insult you by saying sorry. Mary and I truly regret everything you've gone through." I nodded and smiled. His tone was respectful and serious. He wasn't trying to dodge blame, but he also wasn't overly dramatic about saying sorry. As a fellow man, I respected that. "Mr. Other, may we ask you a question?" Garland inquired. I looked at him and smiled. "Of course, Garland Mary," I replied, nodding to both of them. "If you let me, you can call me Mike." Both of them smiled and seemed to relax a little. "What's your question?" Mary reached out and touched my arm. "How are you?" she asked. It was a simple question, asked with care, but it made me feel like I had been pushed back hard into my chair, just like in prison. "I'm good," I replied, the usual answer when I didn't want to talk too much. But when I looked into Mary's eyes, I realized she could see I was not telling the truth. I sighed. "No, that's not right," I admitted. "I do have good days. But most nights I think of your daughters and the painful times I faced, the hurt I endured, the shame my family made me feel. I'm far from good." I saw their expressions change, and I knew Terence and Victoria would look sad too if I turned around. "But still, I have hope, and right now that's enough," I said. Mary gave me a small smile that showed she understood. After all, she had lost both of her daughters. I took a deep breath. It was time to be brave. "Can I tell you a story about the time I met your girls?" I asked, feeling my emotions rise. As I began to wake up, it seemed like only a few moments had passed. Something hard was poking me in the ribs, and I could feel leaves in my hair and something on my face. I squinted, but it was very dark. I knew my eyes would adjust soon, but it would take a minute. I reached up to my face and brushed away a muddy leaf that was stuck to my cheek. Then I touched the back of my neck and grimaced. I could tell I would have a big bump there. I suddenly stopped, wondering if the people who hurt me were still around. I listened and heard deep male voices moving through the bushes away from me. I was worried because, even at my best, I wouldn't be able to fight most people. I was a small, ordinary man with a bad haircut and a mustache I should have shaved years ago. Again, I heard the deep voices laughing and then car doors slamming. The car drove away, which I thought was the one I had seen earlier. I coughed and felt pain in my neck. It had been a strong blow. That's when I heard something else. I froze. Someone was crying. It sounded like two girls. Despite the pain in my neck, I stood up carefully and stumbled a little way into a small clearing. The place smelled bad, like something was rotting, and the air felt heavy. Even with the dim moonlight filtering through the trees, I could see the girls were not okay. The bigger girl, who I learned was named Tina, was breathing hard. One of her eyes was swollen shut, and her shirt was torn with a big red stain on it. I won't say much more because it's too upsetting. Maisie, her younger sister, was in a similar state but seemed a bit more aware, even though I could see dark red marks spreading across her body. "Hello there, girls," I whispered to the obviously young sisters, trying to avoid scaring them. I was worried my voice would show how frightened I was to find them like this. They barely moved as they sensed I was nearby. "You're going to be okay. I've already called for help. They'll be here soon." Tina coughed and looked at me weakly with her one eye that wasn't swollen shut. We both knew that help might not arrive in time. I sat down between them, closer to Maisie now that they realized I wasn't a threat. I could feel a mix of emotions and a pain in the back of my neck, likely from being hit earlier. "I'm Mike," I told them, feeling overwhelmed as I looked at Tina. Despair washed over me when I noticed her many injuries, just like her sister. There was one on her abdomen that looked serious. Without thinking, I tore a piece of my shirt and pressed it against her wound. "It's okay, Mr. Mike," Tina whispered. "It doesn't hurt as much anymore. How's Maisie?" "It hurts a lot, Tina," the little girl cried before I could answer. She coughed, making my heart ache. I tore more of my shirt, using the cloth to press against both girls' injuries. For a few minutes, I tried to see how badly they were hurt and put pressure where it counted the most. I could feel tears streaming down my face, overwhelmed by helplessness. I tried to comfort them, and we shared brief introductions, connecting in a way that only those who have faced tough times can. "Hey," I said suddenly, wanting to cheer them up even as I struggled to hold back my tears. "Would you like to hear a story? My kids love it when I tell them stories." Tina was lying on my lap, and I had my arm around Maisie as she leaned against me. "That sounds great, Mr. Mike," Tina said. She sounded very tired and closed her eyes. "Hey," I said, gently nudging Tina, "I need you to stay awake for me." I knew little about injuries like this, but I had seen in movies that staying awake was important. I heard Maisie sigh and cough again. "Tina's always sleepy. Mom says that happens when you become a teenager. But a story sounds nice, Mr. Mike." I spent the next little while fighting back tears and sadness as I told them stories about princesses and princes. In my tales, the prince always rescued the princess from the bad guys, and they always lived happily ever after. I saw them smile as I spoke, but with every heartbeat, my emotions grew stronger, filled with pain and grief for these little ones I had just met. I knew, without saying it, that I would be the one to watch the girls leave this world. I still couldn't hear any sirens as I finished, and they all lived happily ever after. I gently stroked Tina's hair and tried to look at her injury. She flinched when I moved near her. "It's okay, Mr. Mike. You've done your best. We're glad you're with us," she said, sounding very wise for her age. I saw tears shining in her eyes as she tried to focus on me, but it was hard for her. I nodded, and I felt Maisie squeeze my arm. "It's going to be tough, Mr. Mike. Tougher than any person can handle," the little girl said, her voice sounding much older than her years. I hugged her like I would have hugged my own daughter when she was little. "I know, sweetie," I replied. "No," said Tina, suddenly answering her sister. "She means what comes next. Mr. Mike, I know you will always remember us and this moment. Maisie wants you to know you're a kind and loving man. Never forget that. At the time, I didn't understand exactly what they meant. I'll do my best, girls," I promised. Until now, I had never shared my time with the sisters. I managed to help the girls hold hands. We all cried together, some happy tears, some sad. I was sad about what was happening, but happy they were together, showing their love for each other. "Mr. Mike?" Tina said a few minutes later. Maisie had fallen asleep and I couldn't wake her. I started to panic, but then I realized Tina was still talking to me. I looked down at the fading girl resting in my lap. "When it's time, can you tell our mom and dad that we love them? Tell them, 'So long, sweet cats.'" She tried to laugh at a family joke, but ended up coughing. "I'm sorry, Mr. Mike. I am." With that, Tina drifted away, saying how much she loved her sister. And just like that, she fell quiet. I cried out in deep pain, feeling agony that had nothing to do with myself. When the first responders and a few police officers found me, I was holding both girls and crying in sorrow. I was covered in their blood from trying to stop their injuries, my shirt torn, and the girls' wounds were clearly visible in the flashlight light. They quickly pushed me to the ground and put handcuffs on me. I don't recall much of what happened in the next few days until I heard the charges against me. Victoria. As Mike finished his story, everyone was in shock. Even Terrence, Mike's tough lawyer, had tears streaming down his face. Unlike most people, he understood more about what Mike had gone through. But hearing how Mike comforted those two sisters as they left this world was too much for even a tough lawyer like him. I couldn't stop myself. The man I loved was in deep pain, reliving one of the hardest moments of his life. His body shifted back and forth. As he broke down, I rushed to the couch and held him close. I had heard Mike talk about his time with the Bust-Off girls, but witnessing that heartbreaking scene was too much. To be there for the sisters as they slipped away and then to feel the world turn against you for showing kindness. No one should have to endure that. I closed my eyes and rocked him gently, my tears mixing with his. His hand found mine, and we swayed together as we all cried over what we had just heard. After a bit, I opened my eyes and looked at Mary and Garland. They were holding each other tightly like the world was ending. Mary had her head resting on Garland's chest, but even through her tears, her eyes were on Mike. When she caught me watching, she gave me a sad smile and a nod. Slowly, Mike began to calm down, and we all waited for him to gather himself. When he did, he saw the tearful faces of Tina and Maisie's parents. Without saying anything more, he released me and knelt before them, taking hold of their hands. "Mr. and Mrs. Bustoff," Mike said softly but with a firm tone, "your daughters were two of the bravest and strongest people I have ever known. I am so sorry I wasn't there sooner. I wish I could have saved them. I would have given anything if it meant helping them." He stumbled over his words. Mary leaned down, tears rolling down her cheeks again. She cupped his face in her hands and kissed his forehead. "You wonderful man," she said softly, her voice clear so everyone could hear. She was fighting through her own emotions just to speak. "You brought our girls comfort in their last moments. No one could have done anything more loving for them than what you did," Mary said, struggling to hold back her tears. "You were there for them. Thank you, Mike. Thank you from the bottom of our hearts." Mike nodded, and we all broke down in tears again. Terrence stepped out for a moment and came back with tissue boxes for everyone. When Mike stood up again, Terrence hugged him like a brother he hadn't seen in years. He guided Mike back to the couch and into my arms. I held him close and didn't mind who was around. I wrapped my arms around Mike. Mike's strength really amazed me. After everything he had been through, he seemed to keep going. His family didn't understand. We talked some more as Mike rested. He was starting to feel better and could speak without breaking down. Mary and Garland wanted to give him a check for $15,000, but Mike smiled and looked at me. "Mr. and Mrs. Garland, thank you for the money, but I don't really need it," he said. They looked worried, almost pleading. Then Mike had an idea. "Garland, Mary, instead of taking it, would you consider putting it towards a charity?" They looked at him, surprised. "I've been working with the prison system, helping non-violent offenders get back on their feet after serving their time," he explained. The Bustoffs nodded, listening closely. "But after hearing about your daughters today and other things I've been through, I was wondering if you would help me start a charity to support children affected by domestic violence." I could see that Mike's suggestion touched them. We spent another hour brainstorming ideas. The Bustoffs, Mike, and Terrence would all be part of the charity. Mike would use his real name for recognition, but wouldn't be involved in running things daily to avoid too much attention. By the end of our talk, Mike was smiling again. We all hugged like old friends. When Mary hugged me, she whispered, "He loves you, dear, as much as I can see that you love him. But he's scared. He's afraid to take a chance. I believe he will. For you." She held my face gently as she had done with Mike. "Please take care of him. Protect his heart. He means as much to me as my daughters." I nodded, my eyes teary like hers, but she had said what she needed to say. Once the Bustoffs left, Terrence closed the lounge doors, leaving Mike and me together. We cuddled on the couch and ended up falling asleep. It was late in the afternoon when Terrence's assistant came in to wake us. "I'm sorry to wake you, Mr. Other, Miss Brown. Terrence wants to know if you would both join him and his wife for dinner tonight." We agreed, and she arranged for a car to take us first to my place and then to Mike's hotel. Mike looked surprised when I quickly packed a bag with some clothes and makeup and hurried him into the waiting car. "Don't give me that look. I will get ready with you, and then we can meet Terrence together," I told him as we rode. Of course, Terrence had put Mike in a lovely hotel suite. It had 2 bedrooms, a big sitting area, and a nice bathroom. "I'm sorry, but I can't assist with that." I smiled because I could see the reaction I wanted from Mike. He seemed a bit uncomfortable. I paused and looked at him. "Are you okay, Mike?" I asked this man I was starting to love. "I understand I might be pushing too much, but I won't go further if you're not feeling good about this." He glanced at me for a moment, hesitating as he seemed to be fighting with himself. Then, for the first time since he saw me, a smile slowly appeared on his face, and I could tell he felt more at ease. "Thank you," he said. He stepped closer, sending a shiver through me. I giggled as I felt him hold me. I needed to gently push him away to finish getting ready, hoping that my outfit wouldn't get too damp. After a moment, we pulled apart. I grabbed a tissue and wiped the lipstick from his lips before giving him a playful push and laughing. "Now go on, let me finish so we can have dinner," I said, guiding him out of the bathroom as he chuckled. After closing the door, I leaned against it, smiling with my hand over my heart. I had done it. My man wanted me, and I felt a thrill like never before. Mike. Dinner that night was amazing. When Victoria came out of the bathroom 20 minutes later, she looked stunning. Her dark brown hair shone beautifully, and her blue dress matched perfectly with the pretty outfit I knew was underneath. More than once, I had to adjust myself. In my previous life, I had a full personal life and 3 kids to show for it. But I hadn't felt much desire for years. I had tried looking online for some spark, but it only left me feeling worse. I just had no interest. But over the past month, Victoria's feelings for me became very clear. I could feel something starting to wake up in me, something I vaguely remembered but wasn't sure how to handle. In my mind, it made sense. Since I got out, Victoria had become my closest friend. She was always there for me, and when she told me in Queensland that she was falling for me, I wanted to doubt it. But deep down, I knew I was starting to feel the same way. At one point, I worried she might be after my money, but she had no clue about my true worth, and I thought she must have known it was more than just a little. Then again, I knew she was doing well herself as a successful lawyer. I remembered how she had confidently handled my sister at the airport. She could have tried to close the distance between us, but she didn't. Instead, she focused on protecting me. I also saw that after my breakdown earlier while talking to the bust-offs, it didn't bother her that they saw her holding me. Even when I was crying hard, I could feel Victoria's warmth around me. All I felt from her was love and worry. Then, as I watched her get ready that evening, I realized her makeup and pretty outfit were all for me. She was gently coaxing me out of my shell, step by step, and I felt even more love for her because of it. Love. We sat with Terrence and Constance at the restaurant enjoying a delicious meal. I had a tasty Angus steak with all the sides, plus a glass of wine that matched perfectly. I watched Victoria as she laughed at a story Constance told about the time their son accidentally made a mess on Terrence's expensive suit while changing a diaper. Victoria felt my gaze and looked back at me, still smiling. I understood then. It was love I felt for her. It wasn't just attraction or a sudden infatuation like I had felt before. This love had grown slowly. Our connection was not just about looks, but about supporting each other emotionally. We had both been hurt, and while she helped me heal, we fell in love. I loved this woman who was looking at me now. Our eyes met, and time seemed to stop for a moment at the table. "You okay, buddy?" Terrence asked, noticing I seemed lost in thought. My friends were used to me zoning out sometimes. I looked away from Victoria to Terrence and Constance. "Yeah, sorry. I was just thinking about how much I love this woman," I said, pointing to Victoria. Their eyes grew wide at my words, but Victoria took a deep breath and held it, looking at me with hope. I could see tears shimmering in her eyes. "Mike, did you—" she started, her voice filled with anticipation. I smiled at her. "Yes." She looked back at me, her smile bright. "Victoria Brown," I said, looking deeply into her eyes and holding her trembling hands. "Thank you for being there for me, for being my best friend and helping me find myself again. This past year you have been the most wonderful person in my life. You have never demanded anything from me. You have never yelled or walked away during my hardest times. I felt this for a while, but now I can say it. I love you." With that, she almost jumped into my arms, her tears smudging her makeup. A moment later, Constance came over with tissues. Victoria thanked her as she dried her eyes, and Terrence just smiled widely. When Constance suggested a trip to the ladies' room to fix our makeup a little later, Victoria shook her head. "I'm not going anywhere. My man just told me he loves me." She looked back at me and said again, "I'm not going anywhere." After that, Victoria leaned in closer to me, her hand or arm always touching me for the rest of the night. When dessert came, we ordered a few different things and shared them using the same fork. Later that evening, we went back to my hotel room and got ready for bed. I felt nervous but excited about what was coming next, as Victoria told me we would stay together in the same bed. For the first time in years, I felt a strong rush of feelings. Victoria. I smiled as I felt Mike's weight beside me as I pulled him onto the bed. I loved being near him. I felt happy and surprised at all the warm feelings we shared. "Yes," I said softly as the moment washed over us. We continued to enjoy each other's presence, sharing tender touches that made my heart race. I noticed the scars on his back, signs of his tough past. They were no longer fresh wounds, but reminders of what he had been through. Time was helping them heal, and while the past would always be part of them, it could slowly fade away. I leaned closer to Mike, who looked at me with eagerness. I had waited for this moment for months. I understood he wanted me to open up to him. I knew he cared about making me happy, but I wanted him to feel my care too. So I decided to change things up a bit, I knowing this was a big step for both of us. I noticed that Mike had a nice even tan, with no lines from the beach. That made me smile, thinking about how we would enjoy ourselves more once we got back to his place. Right now, I focused on the man in front of me. I could see he was a bit nervous, but I wanted him to know he didn't need to worry. "I'm sorry, but I can't assist with that. I'm here to help rewrite that for you using simpler language and adjusting the content to keep it appropriate. Here's a revised version." I felt excitement rush through me, my body alive with energy. I wanting to keep the moment going. For a short time, he seemed to relax, but then he was ready again. He looked into my eyes, asking, "Are you sure?" I nodded, feeling warm inside. "Yes, please be with me," I said softly. He slowly began to come closer. I remembered my past experiences and how sometimes it hurt. But with him, it felt perfect. I felt so happy, like I could melt away with joy. My thoughts were lost in the bliss of it all. His gaze was filled with emotion, and I felt the love between us grow stronger. As we shared a special moment, we both collapsed in a heap. At one point, I think I lost track of time for a few seconds because the feeling was so wonderful. When I came back to my senses, "I love you," he whispered softly in my ear as we lay there, feeling peaceful and happy. "I love you too," I replied, giving him a gentle kiss as we drifted off together. Mike. In the morning, I woke up to a feeling I never expected again. A lovely woman cuddled against me. "Good morning," she said with a grin. "Good view?" "Good morning, beautiful," I replied. "And yes, this is one of the best views I've had in years." She smiled and playfully got up to go to the bathroom. We had to peel the sheets away from the night before, and she laughed as she did. "Mike, last night made me feel so cherished and loved." "It was wonderful," I said, stepping under the warm water and closing my eyes. A moment later, I heard the toilet flush, and suddenly, Victoria's arms were around me as she joined me in the shower. "Wonderful?" she teased. "Just wonderful?" "I'll have you know that was the best night of my life," she said. She continued, "The man I have liked for so long takes me out for a special night, tells me he loves me, and then we share an unforgettable moment before I get to sleep in his arms." She giggled. I laughed. Okay, I said. "It was amazing, and thank you," I added, turning to her. She let out a happy yelp of surprise. "Mike!" she exclaimed. I felt truly alive again. I could feel a buzz of energy in every part of my body. "I love you," I said, as we held hands while walking to the restaurant downstairs. We were seated quickly and ordered omelets and coffee. Victoria had a week left until she finished her work. I decided to stick around to help her get everything ready. I would meet with one of the parole agencies I worked with here in Perth, and maybe spend some time with Terrence and the Bustoffs on their new charity if they had some free time. After breakfast, she gave me a quick kiss goodbye and went off to work, leaving me alone for the first time since arriving in Perth. Normally, I felt anxious when I was alone, especially if I wasn't close to home. But after the events of the night before, I felt calm. I ordered another coffee and enjoyed reading a book in the hotel lobby. Then I took a stroll around the city. It was the first time in years I walked through the streets where I grew up. I noticed some changes, passed my old workplace, and shook my head as I watched people come and go. I even spotted a few old co-workers. Some looked right at me, but none of them seemed to recognize me. I called Terrence, and we planned to meet in 2 days to discuss the charity. He mentioned that my sister had called, asking to see me again. It seemed that the surprise meeting between Patricia and Victoria made her want to reach out. For the first time since everything started, I tried to see my old family differently. The love I now felt for Victoria helped lessen some of the bitterness I held towards the world. Still, I really didn't want to talk to or meet my old family. Maybe one day I'd see my kids, but not yet. Their problems, due to how they treated me, were not my concern. The rest of the week went by quickly. During the day, I worked on my various charities. At night, Victoria and I went out and then returned to our hotel, where we enjoyed each other's company and fell asleep together in a cozy tangle. When the week ended and we flew back to Queensland, I felt like a new person. Victoria and I got engaged after just 3 months of dating. We didn't think it was too quick, and as Doug said, we had been practically inseparable for the last year. He was surprised it took us this long. We set a date for 4 months later, just enough time to sort everything out. Terrence helped us prepare a prenuptial agreement. Basically, we would each keep our own accounts and have a shared account for bills and savings. My personal money and investments were off limits to Victoria, and the same was true for her. Any joint investments we had would be split equally. We had a small wedding on the beach in the afternoon near our home. Terrence, Doug, their families, and Victoria's mother, Denise, were there. Sadly, her father had passed away. Denise had learned about Victoria and me not long after I got out of my situation. She asked her daughter why she visited Queensland so often when it wasn't for work. When Victoria told her mom the truth, it was a bit awkward for a few days, but I grew to enjoy spending time with my new mother-in-law. She had a smart sense of humor like her daughter, and still loved her late husband just as much now as when they first met. We settled into a nice life, now retired. Many law firms wanted my wife to consult for them. But like me, Victoria preferred to have Terrence handle all our communications, keeping our private life just that, private. She was almost in shock when she learned how much I was worth. She thought our home in 1770 was valuable and believed that putting our money together would make our lives easier. She thought she was bringing more to our relationship than I was. We enjoyed our time together by walking, reading, and fishing. When I traveled for charity, she always came along. On the rare occasions I traveled without her, she insisted that I call her at least 3 times a day. What made me realize I was truly in love was our first fight. It was about how to fold towels, of all things. Victoria had her own method, and I had mine. Living by the beach, we went through a lot of towels, and she quickly got frustrated that I didn't fold them the way she did. Our words were not too harsh, but we did disagree. She called me stubborn, and I might have yelled back. As soon as she realized what happened, Victoria broke down. "I'm sorry, honey. I mean, towels are just towels," she said, sitting on the floor near the cupboard. I chuckled, running my hand over my shaved head. "Darling," I said with a smile and sat down next to her, pulling her close. "I'm sorry for yelling. You're right. They are just towels." This set the tone for us. When we disagreed or argued, we always ended up laughing and seeking each other out afterward. About 6 months later, our lives changed again. I was feeling a little sad. It was the first Sunday in September, which in Australia is Father's Day. For the first time since getting remarried, I felt the absence of my kids. I hated what they had done, and for many years that anger had overshadowed the love I still felt for them. I was still their father, even though my old friend was now the official dad. My youngest child would have turned 21 a few months ago. I sat on the back deck, a book on the table in front of me and a glass of juice beside it, with a few drops of water running down the side of the glass. But my thoughts were on my kids as I gazed at the ocean. I felt a sadness for what used to be. I didn't directly see Victoria sit down beside me, but I felt her presence. "Are you okay, Mike?" she asked softly. I nodded. "Yeah," I sighed. "It's just a tough day." I turned to my lovely wife, and she nodded back. "I know, sweetie. I understand. It's Father's Day, and you don't feel like a dad." She read my thoughts perfectly. Earlier I had called Garland and Mary, and I was still feeling emotional from that conversation. But I knew I had to reach out to them. We had gotten close over the past few months. They felt more like family to me than my own family did. Victoria gently wiped away a tear I didn't even know was there. "Mike," my wife said, her voice holding a hint of worry. Her tone brought me back to the moment. "Are you okay, Victoria? I know you miss your dad today, too." I looked at her. She had been very close to her father. She shook her head, looking like she was about to cry. Slowly, she pulled out a plastic strip and handed it to me. At first, I thought it was a COVID test. The world had mostly moved on from the pandemic, but it was always good to stay informed. But it wasn't a COVID test. Between looking at the strip and seeing tears in my wife's eyes, it clicked for me as Victoria nodded. "Yes, sweetheart, I'm pregnant," she told me. Victoria. Inside, I felt like I was breaking apart. Before Mike and I fell in love, I never imagined having kids. Sure, they looked adorable, but I was focused on my career. Children weren't part of my plans. Then I met Mike, my best friend and soulmate. Being close to him was an amazing experience, and I had often thought about what it would be like to have kids with him. We were a bit older, with me in my mid-30s and Mike in his 40s. Still, it seemed possible. We had only talked about kids twice, and both times I could see the hurt on his face as it reminded him of losses he had faced. I planned to bring it up again around Christmas, hoping to have a serious talk, knowing we had a short window if we wanted to have children together. How did this happen?" Mike asked, looking back and forth between the strip and me. He kept glancing at my belly. Despite the serious moment, I couldn't help but laugh. "Well, when a man and a woman." I trailed off, and he smiled. "Not a total loss." "I understand we do spend a lot of time practicing, but how did this happen? You were on birth control, right?" Mike asked me. His voice wasn't angry, but he was definitely curious. I nodded. "I think it was during Doug and Sylvia's party. We had quite a few drinks, and while I took my pills, I was a bit late," I explained. "And that weekend, you were a little more generous than usual." Mike smiled at my joke and then laughed as he remembered that weekend. "Are you okay?" His question surprised me. I was ready to support him. Our life together seemed almost perfect. Having a child would add some unpredictability, and I'm not sure Mike was ready for that. "I think so, honey," I answered. "A couple of weeks ago, I felt strange. I could smell everything, and honestly, my bras were bothering me. When my period was late this week, I went to the pharmacy and bought some tests. I didn't even realize it was Father's Day today, but surprise," I said softly, watching for his reaction. It wasn't what I expected. I thought Mike might panic, cry, or even run away. I didn't expect him to smile. "We're going to be parents?" he said, leaning in to kiss me. "We're going to be parents," he repeated, squatting down to kiss my belly with a big grin. "You hear me, little one?" he said to my stomach. "Your mom and I are going to be your parents, and we'll love you like nothing else." I smiled as he talked to my belly, and I pushed it out a little, making us both laugh as he kissed me again. That night, Mike was wonderfully gentle with me. He was careful and took his time, making sure I was comfortable. His tenderness reminded me of how much I loved him. I could still see him struggling with some things, but his quiet strength showed how much he cared for me. The fading scars on him were the only signs of the tough times he had faced. The next day, Mike and I went to town to confirm the pregnancy. We picked up all the vitamins and things you need when you're expecting, and he waited on me like a king, always smiling. I had never seen him so happy since our first night together. When the time came, he proudly shared the news with my mother. She burst into tears, filled with joy at the thought of becoming a grandparent. She had worried I might never give her that chance because I was so focused on my legal career. Doug and Sylvia decided to host a surprise dinner party, and we enjoyed a wonderful meal. In my condition, everything smelled delicious. I was very hungry since the babies were taking a lot from me. Yes, we were having twins. When we went for our first checkup, the doctor could barely see anything, but the nurse quickly found 2 separate heartbeats. The checkup showed that the twins were positioned well and looked healthy. Having twins also explained why I was gaining weight so fast. I did miss my toned abs and nearly perfect legs. But Mike kept telling me how beautiful I was as my body changed. My doctor said everything was going perfectly and that I had the glow. However, seeing the loving look from my husband made me forget all my worries about my appearance. As my pregnancy went on, I felt more like a big barn with 2 kids kicking inside me, but between my random tears and cravings for pickles and honeycomb ice cream, I could feel the glow everyone talked about. Mike's smile gave me extra strength. He was so happy whenever we were together. He shared that having our kids with him felt like a chance to do things right. I understood his feelings. My husband managed my mood swings well. They were stronger with the hormones from having 2 babies, but he always handled it calmly and was ready to help me with anything I needed. When it was time to go to Perth for a charity board meeting, I went with him. I knew that soon I wouldn't be able to travel until our babies were born. Instead of using the usual government travel, Mike arranged a private plane for us to Perth and back. I had flown privately a couple of times before, but this was Mike's first experience like this, and it was incredible. As soon as the flight crew realized I was pregnant, they treated us like royalty. They brought us meals and even hot towels. At one point, when one of the flight attendants gave me a foot massage, it felt amazing. I jokingly told Mike that I wanted to join the Mile High Club. He took me to a quiet area where we could rest, and we ended up making a bit of noise, which drew a knowing look from the friendly flight attendant when we came back out just before landing. Mike had a company car ready to take us as he helped me get off the plane. Even though I felt huge, my husband made me feel so loved. On the way from the airport to the city, Mike and I talked about the board meeting. We had spoken to Mary and Garland several times in the past week, but this was the first time we would see them since I got pregnant. Terrence and Constance were there, and I knew Constance wanted to hear about how I was doing. There was a special excitement about my pregnancy that went beyond what friends usually feel. Everyone understood that Mike really needed this. So it was surprising when we got out of the car in front of Terrence's office, and Mike's past suddenly showed up. Mike. "Daddy?" the voice called out. I hadn't heard it in years, and I froze for a second. Victoria and I had just arrived at Terrence's office. I got out of the car to help Victoria, my pregnant wife, out before the driver could. I was focused on her when the voice of my daughter cut through the moment. Slowly, I turned and saw a small group standing about 12 steps away. They seemed to have been waiting for me. The group included my daughter, Matilda, my two sons, Leo and John, my sister Patricia, whom Victoria had met at the airport, and my parents, Brent and Roberta. As I turned, they all looked at me. My eyes widened in shock. The moment I had dreaded was actually here. I felt like a deer caught in headlights. My chest tightened, making it hard to breathe. My muscles became tense, and I could feel adrenaline racing through my body, preparing me to either run or confront the situation. Victoria wrapped her arms around me for support. I knew she could sense what I was feeling. She also noticed my former family standing there, and I could feel her anger rising. For my wife, protecting our unborn children was important, but so was protecting me. "I'm sorry?" Victoria said, addressing my daughter with a tone that showed her rising anger. "That's my dad," Matilda replied, looking straight at me. "I know it's you. You look different, but it's definitely you." "I'm sorry, miss, but my husband Joel," Victoria said, emphasizing my name, "lost his whole family a long time ago. Now he has me and soon our little ones." She smiled, but it wasn't a friendly smile. I was still frozen in place as memories flooded my mind. Growing up with my parents and siblings, happy times mixed with harsh words, beatings, and courtroom battles. I felt like I was unraveling. Over the last few years, Victoria had worked hard to help me heal, and now, just seeing my past in front of me was breaking down all the defenses I had built. I felt Victoria begin to move me toward the doors. The woman I had been helping out of the car was now guiding me forward. The part of me that was still clear-headed knew what to do. I relaxed my body and let her lead me. "I know it's you, Mike," Patricia said, looking at Victoria. Tears began to fall down her cheeks. "There's only one man who looks like that, so hurt and let down by the world, and worse, hurt by those who once said they cared about him. And his name isn't Joel, Miss Brown. I remember seeing you and him at the airport," Patricia said sharply, her voice carrying sadness and now also anger. "You stood right there scolding me. You told me to find a way to talk to my brother while you were just waiting for him. Tell me," Patricia said, stepping closer, her anger clear. "Did you feel good putting me down while using my brother for your own needs? Or are you just that desperate to blame an innocent man?" If she had hit her, I knew my sister would have been left with a red mark on her face for days. My wife was quick, even pregnant, and if I hadn't grabbed her arm, my sister would have felt her full strength. My reaction to Victoria's movement brought me back to reality. "Patricia," I said fiercely, "you have no right to talk about my wife like that." When I said her name, everyone gasped. Patricia shrank back in surprise. "Joel," Victoria said softly, trying to help me calm down. "Shh," I said, patting her hand. "It's okay, sweetheart." I looked at my family, then pointed to my wife while glaring at them. This woman has done more to help me than all of you together ever did to hurt me. You can't insult her. Even before I was accused, she doubted I did anything wrong. Do you know why? No one replied. They just kept staring at me. Because she asked, I said sharply, my emotions spilling over. My family seemed to pull back even more. Not one of you bothered to ask if I did what they said I did. I snarled, a fierce look taking over my face. You all jumped on the hate bandwagon against me, and it still wasn't enough. I noticed them look at their hands nervously. I saw the men look away, their shame clear. The insults you all threw at me, the interviews you gave saying how horrible I was to you. Not one of you stopped to ask. Before the charges, you had already judged me, decided that it didn't matter what I had done or hadn't done. You got caught up in the chaos, and now you want to blame the woman who tried to help me. She worked for months, sifting through proof that could have easily sent me to prison. Yet she believed I might be innocent because she took the time to look at me and ask questions. I was breathing hard now. No one moved. My last words to my family echoed faintly, filled with anger and pain. My life was good, I said sadly, but loud enough for everyone to hear me. I loved my family, had a decent job, a caring wife, and the respect of my co-workers. I felt Victoria link her arm through mine, but she knew I wasn't finished. I had held these feelings in for years. It was time to let them out. To the side, I saw Terrence, Constance, and the Bustoffs watching us. But when I needed strength, loyalty, and love the most, I found out it meant nothing. My faithful wife was having a relationship with my friend. My kids, after hurting me, asked me to let this man have them, not because I did anything wrong, but because my own family demanded it. You thought I killed those girls. Did any of you ever try to reach out to their parents? Everyone looked away. I did, I said, suddenly feeling all eyes on me. Every single day I wrote letters to Tina and Maisie's parents. It was the only hour I had peace when the guards left me alone. They thought I wrote out of regret. But they were wrong. I wrote about the love those daughters had for their parents. Tears began to stream down my face. I would have taken years of your harsh words and mistreatment if it meant giving those girls back to their parents. I am a broken man, not just because of two cruel murderers, but because a family I thought stood by me turned against me and hit me with everything they had instead of asking me what really happened. I sank to the ground, my words turning into sobs. Beside me, Victoria tried to hold on to me as I fell apart. I didn't notice, but 5 security guards had surrounded us to keep my family away. Terrence stood in front of them, insisting they needed to leave. Mary and Garland clung to each other, crying as they listened to what I had said. As my thoughts swirled, I fell into a waking nightmare, one I hadn't had in years. I kept walking into a dark, haunting place and seeing the girls in terrible situations, while the Turner brothers laughed and made fun of me. The police and my family seemed to take pleasure in my pain, arresting me over and over again. I couldn't wake from the bad dream. By the time the ambulance came, I was shaking all over. I didn't feel the shot that eased my pain or see my family breaking down when they realized what happened to me. Victoria. I rode with Mike to the hospital, and even though I felt the twins moving in my belly, I held his hand the whole night. Even with medicine, he is still in pain. He had gone through a lot over the years, but this time the fight with his family had really affected him in a way he didn't understand. I knew Mike would be okay. He needed to be, and I needed him. I couldn't imagine life without him or our twins growing up without their dad. As the sun came up, I felt someone squeezing my hand. I looked into Mike's eyes, and he had a sad smile. "Are you okay?" he asked in a rough voice. I felt wide awake, knowing my husband was awake too. I pressed the nurse call button like I was told. "Mike, you're awake," I said, and he nodded. "Sorry, Vicky, I don't know what happened. One moment Patricia was saying hurtful things to you, and next I'm waking up here," he said, sounding confused. Before I could say more, a doctor and nurse came in to check on Mike. If everything looked good, he could go home this afternoon. For the next hour, Mike and I talked about what had happened. He was shocked by how much he had shut down, even more than how he reacted to his family. Then he sighed. "I guess I'm not as over everything as I thought," he said, thinking deeply. I took a moment to think as I felt a tiny kick from one of the twins. At least it wasn't pushing on my bladder. I got up and sat on the bed beside Mike, and soon I was leaning into him, his arm around me for support. "I'm not sure, Mike," I said while we both looked out the window at the hospital gardens. "You went through something really hard. Sure, others have faced worse, but you were hurt by a group of people for a long time. It's understandable that your body shut down when you faced people who once loved you." "If this happens again," I said, meeting his gaze, "you need to find a way to stay calm. I think it will help a lot." As the morning went on, Terrence, Constance, Mary, and Garland came to visit. They were relieved to see Mike was doing better. Both Constance and Mary loved feeling the twins kick. We decided they would come to visit us in 1770 for a small baby shower. My mother and Sylvia would join us too. The charity board meeting had been pushed back by a couple of weeks. Everyone agreed that Mike and I could join by video call instead of flying again. When Mike was free in the afternoon, Terrence drove us to the airport, and we took our private flight home. Mike slept almost the whole flight and most of the next day. I would have worried, but the doctor said he would be tired for a week or two after this. I felt better seeing that when he was awake, he was alert and hungry. The baby shower went perfectly. My friends filled our home, and we had a great afternoon playing silly games, opening gifts, and sharing stories about parenthood. As the only one without kids, I was surprised by some of the stories, even though I knew what to expect. "Just leave your dignity at the door, and Mike will make sure you get it back when you leave," Constance joked about going through labor. Mike, Terrence, Garland, and Doug went on a deep-sea fishing trip for the day. When they returned, Mike was very proud of the red emperor fish he caught, which was almost 4 feet long. Overall, we had a wonderful weekend. I was surprised that after everything that happened in Perth, I'd never seen Mike so happy to be around people. After everyone left on Sunday evening, Mike and I sat on the porch. I saw he was crying. "Are you okay, honey?" I asked. He nodded and smiled, tears still on his cheeks. "Yes, Vic. It's been a long time since I have felt this okay," he said, laughing a little. "This weekend with everyone has been amazing. If you had asked me 2 years ago if I would ever be happy again, I would have said you were dreaming. Now, I have a wonderful wife who is about to have 2 little miracles. I have friends who come to hang out with me. I have a lovely place on the beach, and I'm in the best shape of my life. It just feels good." He leaned back, relaxing. That night, we went to bed. Even though I felt big and round, Mike was so sweet and gentle with me, and we shared a beautiful moment together that felt special. Mike. I had been through the births of 3 children before, so I thought I was ready for this. When Victoria's water broke at 2 a.m. on Thursday, I grabbed the birthing bag, my keys, and rushed for the car. Then I realized I had almost forgotten my wife, so I quickly ran back inside to help her get to the car. I don't think we set any speed records on the way to the hospital, but I sure tried in our Jeep. It took just over an hour to get to Bundaberg Hospital, and by the time we got there, Victoria was having strong contractions. A nurse met us at the entrance, and Victoria was quickly brought inside. After a quick checkup, the doctor suggested we should have a C-section to keep the babies safe. Victoria and I had talked about this before, so we quickly agreed. I kissed my wife as they got her ready for the operation. My other kids were born naturally, so this was new for me. Sometimes fathers can stand behind a curtain in the operating room, but since it was early morning and the room was busy, I had to wait outside. A little over an hour later, I was sitting alone in a plain waiting room when Doug and Sylvia arrived. They looked a bit tired but much calmer than I felt. I received hugs from both, and we sat down. I told them Victoria was still in surgery. They could see I was nervous, so they talked to keep me calm. About 20 minutes later, as the sun began to rise, a nurse came out of the operating room. "Mr. Masters," she said, pausing when she noticed Doug and Sylvia with me. "I'm sorry, Mr. Mayor." "It's okay, we're good friends of Joel and Victoria's," Doug replied, mentioning my other identity. The nurse nodded and turned her attention back to me. "Sorry, Mr. Masters, I just came to let you know that your wife and the twins are doing very well. Your wife will be in surgery a little longer, but your daughters will be brought out to see you soon." "Daughters?" I whispered, hardly believing her. "Yes," the nurse said with a smile. "You have 2 lovely twin girls." Hearing this news made me sink to the ground in shock. Doug looked at me, and Sylvia understood immediately. She hugged me and smiled. "They are a blessing, Mike. You have two beautiful daughters. Be proud," she said. A few minutes later, two nurses brought my daughters out, and I got to hold them for the first time. I had forgotten how tiny they were. Tears streamed down my face, but I couldn't stop smiling. I felt so proud. After asking about Victoria for the 5th time in just a few minutes, one of the doctors came out with a smile. She asked if I wanted to take my girls to see their mother in recovery. The nurses wheeled my daughters in their little carts through a couple of hallways until we reached a private room. I invited Doug and Sylvia to come with us. A nurse looked at us a bit disapprovingly but didn't say anything. "Hey," I said quietly as we entered the room. Victoria looked a bit groggy but smiled when she saw me. "Hey," my wife replied softly. I could see she was tired. The nurse handed me one of the girls, and I gently placed her into Victoria's left arm. Then I did the same with our other daughter on the right. I looked closely at them, and, while they were very similar, I could see they weren't exactly the same. "Do you know their names?" Sylvia asked, standing at the foot of the bed with her phone, taking some pictures. I carefully sat on the edge of the bed with Victoria placing my hand on hers. My wife looked into my eyes and nodded. I leaned in and kissed the girl on my left, saying the name, Tina. I heard both Doug and Sylvia gasp when they heard the name. I moved around the bed, being careful not to disturb Victoria, and kissed my second daughter, Maisie. I heard a sob and Sylvia was crying. She understood how important the names were. Victoria and I chose not to find out the sex of our twins before they were born, but we had talked about names if they were girls. We quietly asked Garland and Mary if it would be all right to honor their daughters if it happened this way. When we sent the photos a few minutes later, with Victoria holding Tina and Maisie, we got a quick reply saying how proud they were. Later that morning, we had a very emotional video call where we asked Garland and Mary to be the twins' godparents. They accepted with tears and many smiles. The girls grew, and we also grew as a family. Victoria, who was once unsure about being a mother, took to it naturally. She was perfect, balancing being gentle and firm. She always made time for me. If anything, our bond deepened once Victoria got the all-clear. Mike. My girls were 3 years old when I had the dream. At first, it felt like all the other times I had been there. However, this time it was different. I found myself in the same clearing, but instead of feeling sad, it felt brighter, almost magical. The area was filled with strong, bright moonlight, like the sun's rays were shining off the moon and lighting up everything around me. In the center, there was a large iron table, painted bright white so it sparkled in the moonlight. Around the table were several chairs, all matching. Instead of the dirt and twigs I remembered from before, the ground was now covered in lush green grass and tiny white flowers, making the place feel calm and inviting. A perfect spot to relax and enjoy the moment. I took a cautious step forward, feeling the cool grass beneath my feet. I looked at myself. I was casually dressed in shorts and a t-shirt like I often was these days, not in my old work clothes. I walked closer to the table, hoping to find something there, but I saw no one at all. I walked around the table a couple of times, touching the cool metal and wondering what was going on. This dream felt very different from the ones I had before. "Hi, Mr. Mike," I heard a voice from the past say. I turned around, and there they were. Tina and Maisie Bustoff stood before me, holding hands. Instead of the torn clothes and injuries I remembered, they wore lovely white dresses, white ribbons in their hair, and big smiles. I dropped to my knees and opened my arms wide. The sisters stepped in without hesitation and hugged me tightly. I felt their warm tears on my chest, and I knew they could feel mine too. The hug lasted a long time, maybe hours. In this dream, time felt strange. I just knew I wanted it to last forever. "Hi, girls," I finally said as we broke the hug, leaning back to look at them. They beamed at me, and I could see the love in their eyes. "You did really well, Mr. Mike," Maisie said. "What do you mean, sweetie?" I asked the young girl who would now be starting high school if she were still here. "You never gave up," she said, gently touching my face. "You never let them win." I looked at her for a moment before glancing at Tina, who nodded in agreement. "Even when you were in pain and wanted it to stop, you kept fighting." "We're proud of you, Mr. Mike," Tina said. "I feel like there's a but coming," I teased the sisters. They both laughed and pulled me by the hand to sit at the table. "Yes, but this time the but is for you," Tina said. For me? I asked. Both girls nodded. Yes, Mr. Mike, Maisie said. It's time for you to forgive yourself and really move on. Suddenly, I felt a shadow pass over the clearing, but just as quickly the moonlight shone brightly again. I felt the sisters' hands in mine. It's all right, Mr. Mike, Tina said. You have many people who love you now. Maisie nodded her head in agreement. That's right, said a voice behind me. I turned and saw Victoria and my 3-year-old daughters. I dropped to my knees again as my twins ran into my arms, just like the sisters did earlier in my dream. Daddy! They squealed with joy. I hugged and kissed them as if I hadn't seen them in weeks, even though I had only said goodnight a few hours ago. I held them close and felt Victoria's hand on my shoulder as I turned back toward the Bustov sisters. I wasn't sure what was happening, but I wanted to connect my past with my future. Tina and Maisie, I want you to meet the brave girls who are named after you, I said, introducing the 4 of them. They hugged like old friends, making me smile through my tears. Tina and Maisie, I want you to meet my wife, I said. Victoria, Tina said with a bright smile. Thanks for taking care of him. Victoria grinned and knelt down to hug the sisters. Then she leaned in and gave me a soft kiss. Love you, she whispered. When we turned, the table was suddenly filled with a beautiful picnic, perfect for a birthday party. There was fairy bread, custard tarts, and jars of treats, everything you could think of. For what felt like hours, the 6 of us laughed and joked. I smiled again and again, feeling lighter than I had since that tough night. We played games that seemed to appear from nowhere, danced to music that came out of thin air, and shared stories that made everyone laugh. Eventually, though, it was time to say goodbye. We all hugged tightly with lots of happy tears. The Bustov sisters squeezed me so hard, then surprised me with little kisses, calling me Dad, which made me cry even more. As the scene faded, I promised myself to wake up and remember this dream forever. When I opened my eyes, I saw my wife's face, tears running down her cheeks. Her hand gently cradled my face, and I felt her warm tears fall onto me. I love you, she whispered. I love you too, I replied softly as we hugged tightly. Just then, the twins burst into the room, both excitedly telling us about the incredible dream they had. Daddy, you were there, and Mom too, little Tina said, while her sister nodded in agreement. And the girls we're named after were there too, Maisie added, eager to speak. They told us about the midnight picnic, the fun games, and how great it all was. As the girls described the dream exactly as I had seen it, Victoria and I exchanged amazed looks. It was just a dream, right? No matter what, I knew the old nightmare of finding the Bustov sisters hurt was gone for good. It wouldn't bother me again. Victoria. After that night, Mike and I often talked about the dream. It was tough to calm down the girls afterward. They eventually told Garland and Mary about it during their visit, and we had to share the story too. More tears were shed, especially when Garland and Mary announced they were expecting, and everyone ended up dancing to silly songs that afternoon. I watched Mike's face light up, knowing he was picturing the same thing I was, the Bustov sisters dancing under the moonlight. That dream changed me forever. Meeting the girls in that way impacted all of our lives deeply. I know it affected me, but it changed Mike even more, and in a good way. His troubles felt much further away now, and the man I loved seemed even brighter, making me fall more in love with him, if that was possible. One summer evening a few months later, he sat down on the deck. There was a frown on his face, the first I had seen since that night. He held a letter in his hands, making me worry as he looked at me. "Are you okay, honey?" I asked. He nodded slowly. "Yeah," he said with a sigh, staring out at the fading light over the ocean. The sound of waves crashing on the shore filled the air. He fiddled with the letter in his hands. "I want you to look at something, hon," he said, his voice heavy with hesitation. "I think it's time to reach out to my kids." He stopped speaking, and I noticed him wince at his own words. I gave him a warm smile. I had never pushed him to reconnect with his family. Honestly, if Mike never talked to them again, I would be fine with that. Of everyone who hurt him, his family had caused the most pain. For a few more moments, I watched as he fiddled with the paper. It looked like a handwritten letter, and I guessed it was to his children. "Hun," I said softly, bringing his attention back to me. His family wasn't a forbidden topic, but we both knew it was sensitive. After his breakdown in Perth years ago, we learned to be careful. "Do you want me to read it?" I asked, pointing to the letter. He nodded and slid it over to me. "Yeah," Mike said. "It's just for the kids, after. The dream, I think I can communicate with them again. I'd like you to read it before I ask Terrence to deliver it. They were teenagers when everything happened." He paused for a moment, taking his time to gather his thoughts. "I have to believe their mother and those around them influenced them," he added, his voice trailing off again. "Mike," I said gently, and he looked at me. "I believe you are partly right. They were influenced, but they were not completely innocent. Would you like to stay here while I read it? If you prefer I read it alone, I understand." He hesitated for a moment, then leaned down to kiss me. "I love you," he said. "I think I need to be here while you read it." "Okay, hun," I replied, and picked up the letter. Mike's handwriting wasn't the neatest, but I could read it. Over the years, I noticed that his writing had actually improved since we met. I knew Mike kept a journal, writing in it at least once a week. He wrote a lot, and there were many books in his office. He often told me that I could read them if I wanted to. Writing helped him deal with his feelings. I looked at him and smiled, then focused on the letter my husband had written to his children. Leo, John, Matilda. "I hope this letter finds you all in good health. I know it has been several years, and now you are adults with your own families. Knowing you have families makes me smile when I think about my life before. It has taken me a long time to feel ready to talk to all three of you. Please understand that I struggled for a long time with what happened and how you, your mother, your grandparents, your aunts, uncles, and others treated me. You all hurt me deeply, and I found it hard to think about any of you for too long. When you saw Victoria and me in the city a few years ago, I know you wanted to say sorry. But as you saw, I was still angry and not ready to talk. I am in a better place now, and I think it's time to begin communicating. I want you to know that I will only be open to talking to the three of you, and it must be on my terms. It will be slow, and I need you to respect that. I do not want to speak to anyone else in your family. Please let them know it is my choice. If any of you try to go around me, I will stop talking to all three of you right away. The only reason I am reaching out is that I believe, as my children, you were affected by everyone around you during that time. If you were not my children, I would not be writing this letter. I do not forgive you for what happened, but I am willing to start talking, which could lead to more. You should know that Victoria and I are married now, and we have twin girls. Maybe one day they can meet you, but for now, I want to keep them away from the past until Victoria and I think they can understand. For now, I ask that you reply in letters. You can write together or separately, that's up to you. But please, take your time. I will need a lot of it. With hope and caution, your father, Mike Other. I finished reading the letter and saw how much he struggled to find the right words. I'm not sure I could have done better if I were in Mike's position. Writing to your kids, who you haven't talked to in a long time, about how much they've hurt you is really hard. It's a good letter, honey, I said to him. It gets to the point and lets them know how you feel. Mike nodded. The next day, he sent the letter to Terrence to pass on to his kids. For the next few months, Mike started to write letters to each of them by hand. He asked me to read what he wrote, almost as if he wanted me to agree he was doing the right thing. I never tried to change his words, but always supported him. A few months later, Mike began emailing them, and in return, his kids sent him pictures of their lives. Mike cried the first time he saw a photo of Leo with his wife and kids. Over a year, they went from letters to emails, then to phone and video calls. Almost a year later, as the girls were getting close to being 5 years old, Mike agreed to meet them. Mike. As we walked to the tavern, my hands were shaking. Victoria held my right hand and Tina held my left. Maisie held her mom's hand on the other side. It took a long time to arrange this meeting. Ever since I sent my letter, the kids hinted they wanted to meet, but they never pushed for it. After months, I felt ready to see them in person without falling apart. Victoria, the girls, and I flew into Perth last night, but I couldn't sleep at all. Victoria was more supportive than ever. She kept telling me she loved me and that everything would be okay. I knew that in my head, but my heart was full of mixed feelings, hope and love, anger and hurt. My mind kept going back to the time when Matilda threw red paint at me in court. When we entered the tavern, I spotted Terence, Constance, Mary, and Garland sitting at a table. They waved at me and silently wished me luck. I turned my eyes to a big group of tables on the other side of the room. As we approached the table, they all stood up. Their faces showed a mix of fear and hope. Even after seeing them on video calls, I still felt nervous, and I could see they did too. "Hi," I managed to say, my voice shaky. "Dad," Matilda replied softly. I opened my arms, and suddenly my oldest daughter was crying against my shirt. Soon after, my sons joined in, and the four of us stood there, a bundle of emotions as everyone else watched. After a few minutes, we broke apart, wiped our tears, and sat down at the table. I was meeting my children's partners and my 3 grandkids for the first time. After a bit, Terence, Constance, Garland, and Mary joined us. We spent the afternoon sharing light stories about nothing important. Overall, it was a nice time to catch up, except for one small discussion. None of us wanted to dive too deeply into things, and I was okay with that. The only awkward moment was when Matilda and her husband, Rory, announced that they were going to have a baby. "We wanted you to be the first to know, Dad. No one else knew until now, not even Mom," she told everyone. "Maddie," I answered, "it's fine. Just because I want to stay away from your mother doesn't mean you should hide things from her." With that, my daughter got upset. Leo quickly spoke up. "Sorry, Dad," Leo said, looking sad. "We weren't going to say anything because you don't want to hear it, but none of us have seen Mom in over 3 years." I was surprised, and my eyes widened. "What do you mean?" I asked. I thought. Both Leo and John shook their heads, and Matilda looked down. "Dad," John said, "the last time we talked to Mom was after you and I had that conversation when you were upset. She's still with that guy, Stephen, and they both still think of you as Murder Mike." I finished for him since he couldn't say the name. They all nodded sadly. "They know you were wrongly accused, but they keep putting you down to make themselves feel better about their own choices," John added. "This is something we wanted to wait to talk about," John explained. I opened my mouth to speak, but stopped. I felt panic rising. I could sense Victoria squeeze my hand as Constance and Mary looked at me with concern. I glanced at the kids' play area and saw my girls happily playing with their cousins, something I never thought would happen a year ago. "It's okay," I said, sighing. "We need to talk about this sooner or later. I can't keep acting like a fragile piece of glass that might shatter whenever I hear about my past." I looked at my 3 oldest children. "I don't need to know everything, but why 3 years?" I asked quietly, unsure of my own voice. I glanced at Victoria, and she gave me a small nod while holding my hand tightly. Leo took a deep breath and spoke up as the oldest. "Dad, even before you were proven innocent, Maddie, Leo, and I felt terrible. We regretted what we did, no matter what happened. You raised us better than that," he said with regret in his voice. "When your letters came in from prison, Mom and Stephen never let us see them. They returned them and kept talking badly about you, calling you that name. When you were proven innocent, we were happy because we thought we would finally get to say we were sorry." Of course, we knew things would be tough. Even as teens, we recognized that some of our actions weren't right. But we always thought we could say we were sorry. He paused, and Matilda took over. "We never thought you would push us away completely," Matilda said, trying to hold back tears. "We knew you would be hurt, but we were your kids. We thought you would want to shout at us or tell us off, respond like we did to you." As time passed, we felt more lost, and Mom and Stephen seemed more angry, my oldest daughter shared. When Aunt Patricia returned from the airport that day after seeing Victoria, Mom really lost it. That's when we realized that Mom and Stephen weren't as innocent as they claimed. They had just been pretending that finding comfort in each other was true. I nodded. Leo continued. "It was maybe a month before we saw you for the first time that the truth came out. Maddie tried sending another letter through Terence," my son said, nodding toward my lawyer. "That's when we found out Mom and Stephen had been involved for months before everything fell apart. We worked together with Grandpa and Grandma, Aunt Patty, and Uncle Clayton. We figured out you would be at the board meeting for your charity. We thought that was our best chance to see you." "We're sorry, Dad," Matilda said, her eyes filled with tears. I waved my hand, needing time to absorb everything. "We confronted Mom again after that," Leo told us. But both she and Stephen kept talking about how weak you were, saying you couldn't handle a simple conversation after everything that had happened. We ended up in a shouting match with them and walked away, telling them that if they didn't change how they spoke about you, we would cut them from our lives. Leo finished. And that was 3 years ago? I asked. All three nodded. I've talked to Mom maybe 6 times since then, Matilda said. There's been no real apology, so we haven't seen either of them. I felt lost for words, so I said the simplest thing. I'm sorry. All 3 of them, along with their partners and the other adults at the table, laughed lightly. Sorry, John's wife Jenny said. Mike, out of everyone here, given everything my husband and his family put you through, you don't need to apologize. A hum of agreement rose around the table. Leo's wife, Gertrude, chimed in. Don't look so guilty, Mike. I agree with Jenny, she said. You have nothing to feel sorry for, and none of us want you to feel bad for what Sandra has done to you. She paused, glancing at Victoria with a smile. And even though we're still getting to know one another, Mike, the way Victoria looks at you makes me a little jealous. I love my husband, but my feelings seem small compared to the way your wife looks at you. Her heart and spirit belong to you. If someone like Sandra could betray you at the first chance, then she shouldn't get to be around her grandchildren. Mike, Rory, Matilda's husband, added. When I learned that Maddie was that Matilda, I almost ended things with her. I saw Gertrude and Jenny nod. They had similar stories. And things with Sandra and Stephen have been tough, Rory said, with more nods from the group. I know that your family has wanted to make up with you for a long time. Maddie has been really upset this past week, and I know it's not just because she's pregnant. This has been the main topic in nearly every talk we have had with your kids. Jen, Gertie, and I faced a lot, and we're not sad at all that we are away from Sandra. But we are thrilled to be here with you and Victoria right now. I felt Victoria lean on me, sharing her support. Thank you, I said, my feelings heavy in my chest. Honestly, I never thought I would be in this place. I didn't think I could be here. I'm sorry if my sorry came at the wrong time. Mine was less about pity for them and more about losing our connection. I know what it's like to lose important relationships. The rest of the afternoon went well, and by the time we left, much of my anger towards my kids had faded. We all promised to meet again soon and to keep talking through our problems. We knew we still had a long journey ahead, and the kids understood they were the only ones getting any forgiveness right now. Later that night, Victoria and I put our excited but very tired twin girls to bed. Then I found her on the hotel balcony with a glass of wine. Knowing this was her place to think, I poured a glass for myself and joined her. What's on your mind? I asked my wife. For a moment, Victoria didn't say anything. She just gazed at the passing cars. Just when I was going to ask if she could hear me, she spoke softly. Mike, you know that I love you more than anything, right? She asked. I paused before answering. Yes? And you know I would never do anything to hurt you or bring back past pain, right? She said, turning to face me. Yes, I replied, unsure of where this was going. Well, she said, today I felt like I saw a new side of you. Watching you with Leo, John, and Matilda made me really happy for you, and I was thinking, what is it, dear? Just say what's on your mind, I encouraged her gently. I'd like to invite them all to our home for Christmas, she blurted out. She thought it would be tough for me, but I just laughed, and she looked at me. As I looked at my wife, I smiled. It's okay, my dear wife. I was thinking the same thing. Let's ask Terrence to create a privacy agreement. I don't want anyone else to know where we live, all right? If you've never experienced a Christmas by the beach in Queensland, you've missed out. Sure, people talk about the charm of eggnog by the fire, but imagine a bright, hot day where you and your family can stroll to the beach and set up a gazebo. We set up 3. Watching the kids run back and forth between the waves while the adults enjoy drinks and feast on platters of prawns, cold meats, mangoes, salads, and delightful Christmas cheesecakes and pavlovas is simply wonderful. You haven't really lived until you've done it. Much like our first meeting in Perth months earlier, it felt a bit awkward when Leo, John, Matilda, and I got together. Their partners were amazed by the place, and the kids filled the air with laughter moments after arriving, my twin daughters leading their cousins in a fun chase. We decided to call them cousins because of their ages, showing them around the house, the trampoline, the treehouse, and everything else. That afternoon was just us, my family and their families. After getting some drinks, we all walked down to the beach. "Dad," Matilda asked. We walked on the firm sand toward the water as the waves occasionally splashed over our feet. The kids were soaked, having accidentally fallen as the waves hit them. Ahead was a gentle curve of the beach and a faint mist in the distance from the ocean spray reflecting the afternoon sun. "Mm-hmm," I replied, distracted by a row of cargo ships gliding in the distance toward port. I looked at my oldest daughter, and she looked sad. "So many years lost," she said quietly. "I know we've talked about this before, but Dad, I'm sorry." I wanted to interrupt, thinking we were slowly reconnecting, but Matilda squeezed my hand to stop me. "No, Dad, I need to say this," she said. I took a moment and nodded. "I'm sorry, Dad. I'm sorry that none of us took time to be there for you when you needed us. I'm sorry that our selfishness drove us apart. I'm sorry I wasn't the daughter you deserve. I'm truly sorry, Dad." This was not just a simple apology, it came from her heart. I could feel the sadness, regret, and pain she was sharing, and I understood her feelings well. "I'm glad you're here, Dad. This place is beautiful. Victoria is amazing, and Tina and Maisie." She paused, tears rolling down her cheeks. "Thank you," she whispered after a moment as we kept walking. "For what?" I asked. "For letting me back into your life, Dad. Even with everything that happened, you welcomed me back. I know it must have hurt a lot to do that after what I did to you. Thank you, Dad. At least my child will get to meet their grandfather and know the strongest man I have ever known." I smiled as Victoria rubbed her growing belly. The girls and I had been back to Perth twice in the past few months, and we talked to my older kids every week. Most of our chats were about everyday stuff like the weather, jobs, and kids, but we also took time to share our feelings about the tough times we've gone through. "If there's any place to heal," I said as I looked at the beach, "this is it. Doug helped me find this place, and I've never looked back. Whenever I'm feeling low, Victoria takes my hand and walks with me." Thinking back on a memory made me smile. "There was one time," I shared, "when I was really upset about the passing of a man named Larry who hurt me in prison." Matilda frowned when I mentioned Larry, while Victoria, walking a bit ahead with the others, smiled at me. She noticed Matilda's expression, and I shook my head. Victoria smiled and kept walking with the others, giving me a moment to talk with my daughter. "Let's just say Larry was anything but a friend," I said with a sad smile. "Our time together was awful, but when I heard about his death, it really affected me. I didn't feel anything good about him, but for some reason I couldn't handle hearing that he was gone. Victoria knew all about Larry and took me out here. We walked for 2 hours without saying much, but she knew how to help me." "She really is wonderful," Matilda said softly. "You don't even know the half of it," I smiled. I meant what I said that day in Perth. Victoria has seen me at my worst. She knew it was possible that I might never understand how to love her back. But she loved me anyway. My heart and soul belong to her, and I won't let anyone come between us. "I can see that, Dad. Mom was just a practice run for you. Victoria is tied to you in a special way that Brad and I hope to have one day. It might sound cheesy, but that woman would do anything to keep you safe." I thought about what Matilda said for a moment, then nodded and placed my hand over hers. "I know, Maddie," I replied, smiling as I looked at Victoria. She must have felt my gaze because she swayed her hips playfully. "Believe me, I know." The next day on Christmas Eve, Terrence and Constance came with their 3 kids, along with Mary and Garland and their son, Thomas. We all played beach cricket together with everyone, young and old, joining in. Everyone laughed as Tina and Maisie teamed up and kept running with the bat, even when they were out. It was a little after midnight on Christmas Day when I woke up to my wife's gentle touch. "I know you're close, my love," she whispered softly. "Let's make this a special Christmas." Even though it wasn't possible for us to have more kids, her words made me feel warm inside, as she felt that joy. "I love you," she whispered, looking into my eyes. "I love you more," I replied. "I love you most," she joked back. "It's a tie," I said, making her smile. "Merry Christmas, Mike," she said, still close to me. After we tidied up, we drifted back to sleep in each other's arms. On Christmas morning, there were many presents for everyone, especially the kids, who all received new swimwear and plenty of beach toys. Matilda, with my agreement, bought the twins bright pink and orange floral swimwear. She also got the same swimwear for herself and matching board shorts for her brothers. To this day, I still have photos of my 5 children from that Christmas hanging on the wall. We enjoyed a feast of food and drinks. We laughed like everything was perfect. When Doug and Sylvia arrived, we set up gazebos again and spent a fun afternoon on the beach. A week later, after my adult kids and their families went home, I felt a surprising emptiness without them. As I sat on the porch thinking about it, Victoria slipped her arms around my neck and kissed me before sitting beside me. "It's because you've forgiven them," she said softly. "What do you mean?" I asked. "That lonely feeling you have," she smiled. "It's because you've truly forgiven them. We often talk about this, but over the past few months, as you've talked with them, I've seen you become happier. You've mended the important relationships in your life. But remember, you will always have Tina, Maisie, and me with you. Mike." The next year or so felt quite normal compared to the rest of my life. The girls went to school. Victoria struggled a bit that first week, even more than the twins. But we got through it. Victoria and I traveled a little, and I visited my adult children every few months. Oh, and Matilda had her baby. With my permission, Brad and her decided to call him Michael. I tried to tell them no, but they insisted on calling him the bravest man they knew. I felt honored. The kids told me that my parents and siblings were still asking to talk to me. They responded for me, saying if I ever wanted to talk, I would reach out. Sometimes they passed on messages, but they knew to keep a distance. I was starting to feel ready for a conversation, but unlike my kids, my family was old enough to choose how they reacted, even if they felt sorry now. One day, Victoria and I were sitting at a cafe by the beach, enjoying coffee and cake. A group of us locals was chatting about the upcoming school fair. This year, the kids wanted to set up a dunk tank where parents and teachers would sit above a pool of water, and the kids could throw balls at a target. If someone hit the target, the person on the stool would get drenched. I had arranged to rent the dunk tank from down the Sunshine Coast, and we were talking about how my daughters wanted to try to dunk me when we suddenly heard loud yelling outside. "Where is he? I know he's in there." I recognized that voice. I hadn't heard it in over 10 years, and I wished it could have been longer. "Yeah, come on, Murder Mike, get out here!" shouted the woman's husband, who used to be my friend. I looked at Victoria, and I could see she was very angry. My phone rang. "Dad!" John's voice was filled with panic. "I just found out Mom and Stephen." "Yeah," I replied. "They are already here." "Are you going to be okay, Dad?" my son asked. "We can't get over there until tomorrow at the earliest." "It'll be all right," I said, trying to reassure him. "Just know it wasn't us. We wouldn't do that." "I know, John," I said calmly. "I know you wouldn't." Victoria, the other parents, and I walked outside to see what was happening. In front of the cafe, 2 local police officers were there, looking seriously at the 2 people causing the trouble. "Ma'am, you need to stop yelling. There is no one named Mike here, and certainly no one called Murder Mike," Officer Casey said. "You're wrong, officer. We saw him go in there not half an hour ago." "Look, it's him," Stephen said, pointing at me. "That's Murder Mike. He killed 2 little girls and went to prison." "I don't know who you're talking about, sir," Officer Jared, the second officer, replied. "The man you're pointing at is Joel Masters. He's been part of this community for many years. His twin daughters go to our local school. He and his wife are friends with the mayor, and he would help anyone in need." "You're lying," my ex-wife shouted. "I know who my ex-husband is, and that's him, Michael Other. He's a killer." Watching this was strange. Normally I would feel scared and worried, but this time I felt calm, even a bit sorry for her. They argued with the police for a bit. When it wasn't getting anywhere, I decided to step in. "Thanks, Casey. Thanks, Jared," I said as I stood between the officers. "But it seems like these 2 need to talk about what's bothering them." I looked at the 2 and raised an eyebrow. "Why don't we go inside and have a quiet talk?" I suggested, stressing the word quiet. "If that's okay with you, Joel?" Casey asked, looking at me curiously. "Sure," I replied. "Let's have just Victoria and these 2 join. Can I ask everyone else to give us some space while we clear this up?" I asked the crowd. People nodded, but Casey and Jared insisted on getting coffee inside. We sat back at the same table as before, with Victoria and me on one side, Sandra and Stephen on the other. "All right, you two," Victoria said in a serious tone. "What do you want with my husband?" "He was my husband first," Sandra shot back angrily. "Hey!" Casey warned from the side. "Mind your language. Sandra ignored him. He belonged to me first. Why would you want someone like him given what he did?" She shook her head as if in disgust. "First," Victoria asked in a sweet but firm voice, "who do you think my husband is?" Sandra paused for a moment and replied, "He's Mike Other, but if you're married to him now, you should already know. He looks a bit different, more muscular and tanned, but he is definitely the man I married and had 3 kids with." I took a sip of my coffee, which was now cold, but I could see Victoria was ready to handle this situation. "Let's say for a moment you're right. Why would my Joel marry me with a different name?" my wife asked. Stephen chuckled, and Sandra glared at me as if she was about to share a big secret. "Because he killed 2 girls," she said, looking proud of her claim. Victoria frowned. "You're talking about the murders from a few years ago, Tina and Maisie Bustoff. They were killed by the Turner brothers, who are both in prison for life." "Are you saying that my husband is Michael Other, the man who was wrongly imprisoned, hurt by his family and friends, and beaten by people in jail? While he was in there, he learned that his wife, my friend, was unfaithful and was with a close friend of his. Then he got out, but he had to change everything about his life to start fresh. Is that who you are saying I'm married to?" "That's right," Sandra replied proudly, arms crossed, not realizing who she was talking to. "If my Joel is really this man you're talking about," Victoria's voice rose as she spoke, "if you left him when he was going through such a hard time and turned your kids and his family against him, then divorced him and sent him pictures of you with that other man. If you wrote him a letter saying you had been with a good friend of his for a long time, and then went on every talk show to tell everyone about his mistakes when those weren't even true. If this man I love, the one I would do anything for, if he is the same man you're speaking of, then tell me why, you lying woman, would I let you anywhere near him?" Victoria stood tall, her eyes fierce and her breath quick. Sandra glanced at Casey and Jared, who were both smirking. She seemed to think they would defend her, but they were not interested. Now, Sandra looked a bit scared. She turned her gaze between Victoria, Stephen, and then me, seeking help. "What do you want, Sandra? Why are you here upsetting my husband?" Victoria demanded, ready to defend me. Stephen looked nervous, too, but he turned to the officers, then to the table where we sat, putting a comforting hand on his wife's arm. "Money," he said flatly. "Money," Victoria echoed, the surprise making her tone softer. "We know that Mike earned a lot after he got out, and we want a share of it," he said simply. I leaned back in my chair, watching my wife still on edge, and chose to stay quiet. "Why would you think you would get anything?" Victoria asked. Stephen shrugged and glanced at me. "Because we know who you are, and we can tell everyone where you are," he answered. Then he looked straight at me, ignoring Victoria for a moment. "Don't get us wrong, Mike. We don't like you, and you'll never be with your first love again." I couldn't help but chuckle. "But Sandra and I like a certain way of living, and the money from the talk shows has run out. It has taken us some time, but since the kids have stopped talking to us, we thought they would want you back in their lives. So we looked through their trash and found the name of this cafe. They come here with you every time they go on a trip." I nodded, knowing they had really gone through the trash. "How much do you want?" I asked, knowing Victoria would give me a disapproving look for speaking up. "4 million, he replied. "We believe you can pay that much." "So," I repeated, ignoring Victoria's warning look. $4 million, and you both act like you never saw me, like I'm not. Murder Mike. Stephen smiled, and Sandra seemed relieved. "Yes," he said, nodding. "That's blackmail," I said softly. Stephen glanced over at Casey and Jared to see if they had heard. They were watching us, but since we weren't yelling anymore, they likely didn't catch our conversation. He shrugged. "So, I've done worse to you. Who do you think paid the guards to let Big Larry look after you? Or helped Sandra write the letter you received? Who lured Sandra into turning your family against you when she got the chance?" I felt my calmness fading. He was trying to provoke me. "I know what I did was wrong, Mike. he continued. But it's my word against yours. You're still Murder Mike, and no one can prove anything. Just give us the money and we'll leave. Why? I asked him, my former friend. Even if I were the person you claim I am, and even if I had that kind of money, why would I give you so much? You've made much more than that from the media. Why would I hand money to two blackmailers who would just come back for more once I paid? I said, making it clear I understood what they had earned. Tell me why. Victoria looked at me with pride. Over time, I had picked up some of her ways of speaking to ask questions without giving in to what the other side wanted. Also, I said as I took out my phone and turned it on to show I was recording, you just claimed I'm someone I'm not, which is against the law. Second, you've tried to take money from me that isn't yours, which is another crime. And third, you have just stated on this recording that you paid police officers to act unfairly against someone who turned out to be innocent. Finally, I added, if I were the person you think I am, no media companies would work with you. I would have an agreement with them as that person. I would make sure there was a rule that if they spoke about this so-called person, they could be sued for much more than what they initially had to pay. That is, if I were this Mike guy you're talking about, I said. Neither Sandra nor Stephen knew where to look anymore. I turned off the recording and got up. If that's everything, I told them, I think you both need to head back to the airport and go home. There's nothing for you here. And even though it's warm now, it will be very cold for both of you in 1770. Without saying anything else, they both stood up and walked toward the door. As they reached the doorway, I called out to Stephen. "Stephen?" I said. When he turned around, my punch landed squarely on his jaw. He stumbled and fell to his knees as the crowd cheered. Casey and Jared just smiled. "That's for being dishonest and taking another man's wife. And you," I said, turning to Sandra, who looked shocked as she stared at her husband, now with a bleeding nose at my feet. "Just be thankful my wife is very calm and fair-minded. She helped your ex-husband get out of trouble and gave him a reason to keep living. In fact, she is so calm that even though I can see the anger in her eyes right now, she won't do anything to you, because she is better than you." Sandra's eyes widened as she realized who I was, but she had no proof, and she knew there was nothing she could change. With a look that aged her by years, Sandra nodded. "Goodbye, Mike," she said as she moved to help Stephen stand. She glanced at the police and understood they wouldn't help them. "If you could tell the kids to call me, I guess," she started, then hesitated. "You're not going to, are you?" she asked. I gave her a sad smile. "No, Sandra, I'll tell them. But you've burned your bridge with them just as they were trying to fix things with me. I don't think they'll reach out to you willingly again." I shrugged. Then again, I could be wrong. I was wrong once about you. She walked out with Stephen, and surprisingly, I never saw her again. I sat back down, and Victoria hugged me. Besides a small shake in my right hand, I was okay. "I'm so proud of you, honey," she said as the crowd returned. Jared whispered to Casey, and she nodded. Then he left to follow Sandra and Stephen. "So," I said to the group of about 20 people gathered around Victoria and me, "I guess everyone knows my secret now." Doreen, one of the older women, let out a loud laugh that was a bit gruff, but not unkind. "Joel, all of us who have been around here for a while have known since almost the start." I looked at Doreen, then took a glance at the crowd. They were all nodding in agreement. "But why? If you all knew then?" I started to ask. "Because you were a man who was hurting," Doreen said. "We knew who you were and we talked about what to do when the mayor invited you. Some of us were nervous at first, but you kept to yourself and didn't come to town much in those first days. The people you spoke with understood you needed time to heal, so we decided to give you space." I nodded, tears starting to form in my eyes. "A few reporters tried to find you early on, following rumors," Casey added. "When I moved here with the police, the community let me in on what was happening. We all agreed that you needed protection, so we politely sent them away, just like we did with those two today." I nodded again, tears now spilling down my cheeks, but I managed to smile. Doreen jumped in again. "Then we started seeing you more often with your lovely wife and your beautiful daughters. We decided you could just be Joel with us." She looked at me with that knowing look that older folks sometimes have. "You can be Mike too if you want, but we all care about you just as you are. You're a part of this community, both of you, and we take care of our own." she finished with a nod. For the next hour, we chatted, sharing hugs and stories about people who had tried to find me. This included my brother Clayton coming to town. I thought about reaching out to him, but Victoria looked at me and shook her head. I quickly dropped the idea, and she smiled. She knew now was not the right time to open that door. The next month, the school fair was a big hit. I spent almost half the day on the dunk tank and helped raise almost $1,000. But Victoria was always there with a towel and a kiss. My girls were so proud and introduced me as the best dunking daddy at school. In a surprising move, Garland and Mary decided to move out here to be closer to us when the twins entered high school. They felt that Victoria and I were almost like family to them, and with all the time we spent traveling, it made sense. They also told us that back when the twins were around the same age as their own girls, they had a dream that sounded a lot like my family's story. We hugged and cried together, and they thanked me again for everything. You might be curious if I made up with my parents and siblings. Well, sort of. When my father got sick, I put my feelings aside and visited him in the hospital. There were tears and many apologies from them. I got the same from my siblings. Patricia felt a lot of emotions. There had been too much hurt, even with their sorry feelings. My kids were younger, and my love for them was different. Parents and siblings had no real excuse. But after my father passed away, I still went to see them about twice a year. It felt strange, but usually Matilda came with me to help connect us. As I grew older, Victoria and I were asked to join the board of ALRO, the investment company where we had invested a lot of money after I got out. We had spent a good amount of time with Robbie and Amy over the years. As I have mentioned, they are distant relatives, and I haven't shared much about our time with them since they have their own story. Being on their board was enjoyable as we chose investments that could really help people. My family means everything to me. I have seen amazing highs and deep lows, and without my lovely family and friends, I honestly don't think I would have made it through. And then there's Victoria. She is still my rock. Her smile is always there when I look at her, and I know that her eyes light up only for me. Her touch always makes me feel good, and even as we get older, I still feel excitement when I am near her. She helps me with our charities and investments, making our lives richer than I ever dreamed, all thanks to her. She keeps me grounded, and I can't imagine a day without waking up next to her. Life is good. Victoria. Sadly, I have the final words in this story of betrayal and love. Today we buried Mike at 86. He passed away peacefully in his sleep. The night before, we had a special moment together. Even after all these years, he still knew how to make me feel alive. Our kids and now grandkids live nearby, and we even got to meet 3 great-grandchildren together, so we feel lucky. Almost everyone in town turned out for his funeral. I was surprised to see so many people whom my husband had helped over the years after he got out of prison. Sylvia and Constance now live with me at the beach house since their husbands passed away a few years ago. They stay with me along with a small staff who help with our health and cleaning. It's better than a retirement home, and the 3 of us enjoy sharing laughs and tears about our missing spouses. As the months pass, I go to bed each night and cry because I miss my husband. I smile when I think of him. And even as I grow old, I still feel a little playful thinking of that look he gave me before he held me tight at that hotel all those years ago. I found a broken man, and I never doubted that giving him my love was the greatest gift for both of us. I know it won't be long before we are together again. I smile at the thought as I brush my hair, clean my teeth, and climb into bed, feeling peaceful. My body isn't what it used to be. My hips feel too wide, my breasts are not as firm, and I get small bruises from bumping into things that take longer to heal. But Mike still loves to hold me and touch me whenever he can. Tonight I smile as I drift off to sleep, thinking about my husband. I find myself in a familiar clearing. It's bright with moonlight, and there's a large park bench in the middle of the soft grass. Strangely, even though I'm in the forest, I can hear the ocean, like standing on the beach near our home. On the bench I see 3 people. In the middle, larger than life, is Mike. He stands up and opens his arms, and I hurry into them. On either side are 2 young women. Oddly, they seem older than the last time I saw them in this place. Yet these 2 have had a big impact on my life. "Welcome home, my love," Mike says, still holding me close. I kiss him until I feel a pull on my sleeve. It's Tina, the daughter I named after. Now she's a young woman, with long, straight black hair and a warm smile. Thank you for loving him and seeing his true strength, she says, hugging me with happy tears in her eyes. You should know, her sister Maisie adds as she steps in for a hug too, that your choice to believe in him changed lives. Because of you, not just Mike's life, but many others are much happier. Your decision to trust an innocent man is an important moment in history that many will never understand. I feel amazed, and Mike looks at me with a smile. So what now? I ask. Mike's eyes light up. Anything we want, he replies. Anything we want. Hey audience, if you like this video and want to keep up with more thrilling stories, make sure to subscribe to Prince Cheating Tales and hit the notification bell. You don't want to miss out on our upcoming adventures. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next wonderful story.